Welcome to Sleepy Sagas, where historical figures come to entertain your sleep. Alexander the Great, the man who conquered the known world before he turned 33. Conqueror of Persia, founder of cities, son of Zeus, or so his mother said. He burned Thebes before breakfast, crushed Darius III before lunch, and still had time in the afternoon to invent a few dozen cities to bear his name. A man of vision, a big ego, and, let's be honest, questionable moderation when it came to wine and love. History calls him a god among men. His soldiers called him king. His enemies called him death. But Hephaestion, well, let's just say Hephaestion might have called him something a little more intimate. This is the story of a man who was bigger than his empire and loved more fiercely than his statues could ever imagine. This was Alexander of Macedon, great on the battlefield, even greater at complicating dinner parties. This is not a story of glory, but of obsession, ambition, and the price paid for conquering the world. No one can deny his greatness, but today, let him lull you to sleep. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Part 1. Legendary Military Conquests. Chapter 1. Unifying Greece and Consolidating Power. Let us begin, not with a grand battle, but with a corpse, specifically the corpse of King Philip II of Macedonia. A warrior, a diplomat, a political mastermind with a rather distracting number of wives, and a man who spent most of his career preparing his son's future, right up until someone slipped a blade between his ribs. The year was 336 BCE. The location, the ancient Macedonian city of Aegae. The occasion, a royal wedding. Philip entered the theater in all his splendor, unarmed, flanked by guards, surrounded by nobles, and just a few steps from world domination, until he was murdered in front of them all. The assassin was one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias, who was promptly hunted down and killed by fellow soldiers before anyone had the chance to ask the obvious question: why? Rumors, of course, spread like wine at a Macedonian banquet. Some whispered it was personal revenge. Pausanias had a long and complicated grudge involving courtly dishonor and humiliations. Others, more ambitious in their storytelling, hinted at conspiracy. Olympias, Philip's fourth wife and mother of Alexander, was known for her dramatic flair and serpentine interests, both literal and political. And then there was Alexander himself, 20 years old, brilliant, restless, trained by Aristotle, raised on the Iliad, told from birth that he was destined for more than just a throne, that he was in fact the son of a god. He was also conveniently nearby when the murder occurred. Now, to be fair, suspicion does not equal guilt, but history has always enjoyed keeping one eyebrow raised. Whatever the truth, within hours of Philip's death, Alexander acted with a kind of ruthless clarity that made people stop questioning and start obeying. The court was locked down. Rivals were eliminated, some quietly, others less so. His cousin Amyntas IV, who had a stronger blood claim to the throne, was executed. Other potential threats simply vanished into dungeons or graves. Olympias, ever the helpful mother, reportedly arranged the deaths of Philip's other wives and their children. One way or another, there would be no alternative heirs. With the palace secured and his enemies silenced, Alexander turned to the one institution that truly mattered in Macedonia, the army. These were the hardened veterans of Philip's campaigns, men who had marched, fought, and bled under his banner for decades. Winning them over would not be easy, but Alexander was no stranger to performance. He stood before them, calm but commanding, dressed in armor too polished for coincidence. He reminded them of his lineage, son of Philip, student of Aristotle, descendant of Achilles. He invoked the victories of his father and the vision of something even greater, a war against Persia. A campaign that Philip had planned but never begun. A chance for glory, wealth, and revenge for the burning of Athens a century earlier. They cheered, not because they trusted him, not yet, but because they saw in him the same fire they had once seen in his father, and perhaps something more dangerous. Philip had conquered Greece. Alexander would promise the world. Still, there was unfinished business. Across the Aegean, the Greek city-states had heard the news and saw opportunity. Thebes, Athens, Sparta, tired of Macedonian dominance, they murmured of rebellion. Some sent envoys to Persia, others rallied their militias. Alexander had barely warmed the throne before his authority was being tested. So he responded the only way he knew how: fast, dramatic, and a little terrifying. Within weeks, he marched south. The speed of the Macedonian army caught the Greeks off guard. He moved with purpose, not hesitation. He crossed into Thessaly, forced submission without bloodshed, then pressed onward to the Peloponnese. When he reached Corinth, most cities yielded. The League of Corinth, a loose confederation of Greek states under Macedonian hegemony, confirmed Alexander as its new supreme commander. Even Athens, bruised but cautious, reluctantly accepted his authority. But Thebes chose defiance. Thebes had always been proud, always difficult, and now, newly hopeful in Alexander's youth and supposed inexperience. They declared independence. They fortified their walls. They underestimated him. Alexander returned in the autumn of 335 BCE with his army and surrounded the city. The siege was swift and brutal. The walls fell, the defenders were slaughtered, and the city, once a great power in Greece, was destroyed almost completely. The survivors were sold into slavery. The city itself was razed. A message carved in stone and silence. After Thebes, there was no more talk of rebellion. The other city-states fell quiet. They had seen what happened to defiance. They had seen what a 20-year-old could do with a well-trained army and something to prove. In the span of months, Alexander had secured his kingdom, crushed a rebellion, inherited a league, and silenced his critics. He had inherited a throne built on conquest. Now he would need a world worth conquering. Persia waited. The great empire of Darius III loomed beyond the sea. Alexander, newly crowned, barely aged out of adolescence, was ready to meet it, not with diplomacy, but with war. And so, a king was made, not through coronation, but through calculated fear, swift violence, and the careful manipulation of legend. He was his father's son, yes, but he was already becoming something far more dangerous. A ruler who believed his destiny was not on this earth, but written in the stars. Thebes had always considered itself special. Situated in central Greece, proud and poetic, it had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Athens and Sparta. It had produced philosophers, warriors, and more than its fair share of problems. When Philip II of Macedon took control of Greece, Thebes bowed, but never willingly. And when Philip died and Alexander took the throne, Thebes saw a crack in the armor. He was young, barely 20. Rumors of his father's assassination swirled through every symposium in Athens, every smoky temple in Corinth. Macedon, Thebes believed, would fall apart without the old king's iron will. This boy, this Alexander, was untested, unknown. Surely the empire would shudder, hesitate, and break. So Thebes revolted. At first it was cautious. Messages were sent to Persia. Whispers passed through taverns and barracks. When Alexander marched north to secure Thrace, Thebes thought it safe to act. They expelled the Macedonian garrison. They declared the king dead. They dreamed of independence. A mistake, a large one, possibly the worst one they ever made. Because Alexander wasn't dead. He wasn't even delayed. He had moved through Thrace with terrifying speed, silencing uprisings and replacing garrisons with barely a pause. And when he heard what Thebes had done, he didn't call a council. He didn't send a warning. He turned the army south. Immediately, he crossed over 300 kilometers in less than 2 weeks, arriving outside Thebes in late summer, 335 BCE. His arrival was not met with cheers or parades. The city's leaders panicked. They hadn't expected him so soon. Perhaps they hadn't expected him at all. Some wavered. Some fled. Some stood firm. Thebes prepared for siege. Alexander prepared for something worse. What followed was not a prolonged war. There was no long standoff, No drawn-out campaign with diplomats shuttling between tents. Alexander, decisive as ever, offered one chance: surrender. The Thebans refused, so he ordered the attack. The Macedonian army was relentless. Veterans from Philip's campaigns led the assault. Siege engines tore at the walls. Infantry stormed the breaches. Once inside, there were no half measures, no restraint. Alexander did not simply want to defeat Thebes. He wanted to erase it. By the end of the assault, over 6,000 Thebans were dead. More than 30,000 were captured and sold into slavery. The city, walls, temples, theaters, homes, was reduced to rubble. A few sacred sites were spared, but only for appearance. Everything else, gone. There had been rebellions before. There would be rebellions again. But no one in Greece ever forgot what happened to Thebes. Athens, which had also entertained the idea of revolt, now trembled with diplomatic enthusiasm. They sent envoys. They praised Alexander's leadership. They hosted feasts in his name. No mention of Philip. No mention of the rebellion. Just smiling faces and nervous flattery. It worked. Alexander, despite his ruthlessness, understood politics. He accepted Athens' gestures. He didn't burn their city. He didn't enslave their citizens. He needed Greece unified, not flattened. At least, not all of it. To many modern minds, the destruction of Thebes feels excessive, even brutal. Even for the ancient world, it stands out. But in the logic of kingship, especially Macedonian kingship, it was entirely calculated. Alexander was sending a message, one that didn't require translation. I am not my father's shadow. I am your ruler now. You will not challenge me. And if you do, you will not be remembered. The destruction served another purpose too. It secured his rear. The campaign against Persia, long dreamed of by Philip, would require every ounce of manpower and focus. Alexander could not afford to leave unrest behind him. By wiping Thebes off the map, he ensured silence. Fear became his strongest ally. But there was something else, something less obvious, something historians often debate with furrowed brows and tired pens. Alexander wasn't just punishing rebellion. He was also beginning to build his myth. Thebes had once been the city of heroes. It had given Greece its legends: Oedipus, Heracles, Cadmus. Now that city was gone, its past erased, and in its place stood a new legend. A conqueror who did not tolerate hesitation, who moved faster than logic, who burned the world before it could whisper. A legend that said, Alexander does not wait. It is easy to overlook this moment in the sweep of his campaigns. After all, Thebes was only a city, but in reality, this was the moment Alexander became more than a Macedonian prince. This was when Greece stopped asking if he could rule and started asking how long they could survive under his rule. It was also a moment of transformation. Alexander, who had grown up listening to the Iliad, now began to act like he lived in it. He wasn't merely a king anymore. He was Achilles reborn, sword in hand, wrathful and radiant. The gods would not guide him. They would follow behind in awe or fear. To those living under his rule, this made him terrifying. To his army, it made him unstoppable. And to the world beyond the Aegean, it made him very, very real. News of Thebes traveled fast. Across the Aegean, across the Levant, into the satrapies of the Persian Empire. Darius III, king of kings, heard of the destruction. He had thought Alexander a nuisance, a Macedonian boy playing king. Now, he began to understand the truth. The boy was not playing, and he was coming. So Alexander left the smoldering ruins behind him. He allowed the soil to remember Thebes so the world wouldn't have to. He had a league behind him now. Greek unity, forced, fearful, but effective, was his. The road east was open. The fleet prepared. The campaign long promised by Philip would now belong to his son. But Thebes never really left him. Its ashes clung to his legend. Its silence followed him across deserts and rivers. And though he would conquer empires far grander, destroy cities far wealthier, Thebes would always be his first, and most symbolic, act of imperial violence. It was, in its way, a beginning, not just of conquest, but of what Alexander would become. a king not simply remembered for what he built, but for what he dared to destroy. Alexander's destruction of Thebes wasn't just an act of war. It was more precisely a theatrical performance with fire, blood, and consequences. And the audience, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and the rest of the ever-bickering Greek world, sat in stunned, reluctant silence. For better or worse, they now understood one thing clearly. Alexander was in charge. Of course, they didn't exactly leap into his arms. Greece, after all, was not a kingdom. It was a quarrelsome family of city-states, each with its own politics, dialects, and deeply held grudges. It didn't trust kings. Most had only recently been at war with Philip II, and Alexander, despite his flair for lightning-fast sieges and poetic revenge, had not yet earned their admiration, only their caution. But history has a way of favoring those with large armies and short tempers. After the fall of Thebes, the surviving members of the League of Corinth, the political alliance forged by Philip, called a meeting. There, under the not-so-gentle suggestion of Alexander's continued military presence, they confirmed what was already painfully obvious. Alexander would be the League's new hegemon, its supreme commander. Now, on paper, this sounded like a united Greece rallying nobly under a young and charismatic leader to strike back at the Persian Empire. In reality, it was more like a group of terrified neighbors agreeing to let the guy with the torch lead the homeowners association, if only so he wouldn't burn down another house. But titles matter, symbolism matters, and Alexander knew how to use both. With this official appointment, he now had the legal and political authority, at least in theory, to lead a pan-Hellenic war against Persia. It gave his invasion legitimacy. It gave him troops. It gave him ships. And, perhaps most importantly, it allowed him to frame his upcoming war not as an act of Macedonian aggression, but as vengeance. Vengeance for the Persian sack of Athens a century before. Vengeance for Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis. Old wounds reopened and repackaged into a shiny new cause. But make no mistake, this wasn't about justice. This was about glory. And Alexander wasn't interested in reclaiming honor. He was interested in rewriting history, with himself at the center. Before setting off, he toured the religious centers of Greece. Not because he was particularly devout, but because even tyrants need public relations. He visited Delphi, home of the oracle, though she reportedly refused to prophesy for him. Alexander, never one to accept no from anyone, divine or otherwise, allegedly dragged her to the shrine by force. According to legend, she shouted in frustration, "You are invincible, my son." That, apparently, was enough. At Olympia, he paid tribute to the gods of the games. At Corinth, he met the philosopher Diogenes, who lived in a barrel and famously told Alexander to stand out of my sunlight. It was perhaps the last time anyone in Greece dared speak to him that way and lived. Still, the diplomatic tour worked. The people saw not just a warrior, but a statesman, a conqueror in ceremonial robes, a king who paid homage to temples even after reducing cities to rubble. Fear and reverence blended in perfect balance. And now, with Greece pacified, or at least muzzled, Alexander returned to Macedon to prepare for the campaign that would define his legacy, the war against Persia, a war his father had only begun to dream, a war that would become legend. The League of Corinth's backing meant that troops came not just from Macedonia, but from across Greece. Archers from Crete, cavalry from Thessaly, hoplites from Athens and Thebes, yes, even Thebes or what was left of it, forced conscripts, reminders of defeat, soldiers who marched not because they believe in Alexander's cause, but because they had no choice. Altogether, the army numbered around 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Not a large force by Persian standards, but it was disciplined, unified, and led by a man who had already shown the world what he was capable of when merely provoked. It's worth pausing to appreciate the audacity here. Alexander wasn't just attacking a kingdom. He was attacking the largest empire the world had ever known. Persia stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, from the sands of Egypt to the steppes of Central Asia. Its bureaucracy was vast, its coffers deep, Its army counted in the hundreds of thousands. And yet, this 20-year-old Macedonian king, with no experience ruling an empire, no naval superiority, and the enthusiastic support of exactly 0 major powers, decided that he would take it all. And what's more, he expected to win. Not that he said this out loud, of course. Publicly, he invoked revenge, duty, honor, even divine will. Privately, he studied maps. He read accounts of Xenophon and Herodotus. He analyzed the routes his father had planned and improved them. He appointed satraps in advance, governors for regions he had not yet conquered. His invasion wasn't a gamble. It was a blueprint. But ambition has its costs. At home, he left behind an uneasy kingdom. His regent, Antipater, was capable but resented. Olympias, his mother, remained powerful and unstable. And the Greek city-states, although officially united under his command, still seethed beneath the surface. If Alexander failed in Asia, they would rebel. If he succeeded, well, they might rebel anyway. Yet Alexander did not hesitate. He had been crowned by war, proven himself through destruction, and elevated by the trembling hands of his enemies. Greece had, however reluctantly, recognized his rule. The League of Corinth had, if not enthusiastically, accepted his authority. It was enough. With rituals completed, alliances confirmed, and a final sacrifice offered to the gods, Alexander set his eyes on the east. He would cross the Hellespont, the ancient waterway separating Europe from Asia, just as Achilles had once done in the stories his mother told him as a boy. But this time, there would be no Trojan War, no 10 years of siege, no wooden horse. This time, the war would be real, swift, and terrible. Alexander did not just want to defeat Persia. He wanted to replace it. He would not be content with tribute or treaties. He would stand where Darius once stood, wear his crown, rule his people, burn his palaces, and in the ruins, build something new. An empire with himself at the center and the rest of the world spinning around him like obedient stars. He had the title now, Commander of the Greeks. He had the pretext, revenge. He had the soldiers, the ships, the dreams, and, perhaps most importantly, he had no intention of stopping. The war had not yet begun, but Alexander was already unstoppable. Chapter 2, The Persian Campaign. The crossing of the Hellespont was not just a logistical step, it was a ritual. One part history, one part theater, and several parts ego. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander of Macedon stood on the shores of Europe, gazing eastward across the narrow ribbon of water that separated his ambitions from their proving ground. The Hellespont, known today as the Dardanelles, was not wide, but symbolically it was an ocean. On one side, the familiar world of Greece. On the other, the vast unknown of Asia. Persia, empire, legend, risk, and Alexander, never one to miss a moment of symbolic importance, did not simply march across. He sailed, with ceremony, with spectacle. He visited the supposed tomb of Achilles at Troy. He made offerings. He crowned the dead hero with a garland and claimed, without a trace of modesty, that Achilles was fortunate. He had found a Homer to sing his name. Alexander, of course, expected to do one better. He would live a life so brilliant, so unforgettable, that no poet would be necessary. His victories would speak for themselves. Then came the business of war. Alexander's army, roughly 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, landed on the Asian shore, the first Macedonian soldiers to touch Persian soil. The campaign had begun. The invasion was real, and Persia, vast and ancient, was about to wake up to an unpleasant surprise. News of the landing spread quickly. The local satraps, Persian governors, scrambled to respond. Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary in Persian service, had urged a cautious strategy: burn the land, deny supplies, avoid open battle. But the Persian commanders, confident in their numbers and their terrain advantage, chose something far more traditional: stand and fight. They met Alexander at the river Granicus. Now, the Granicus was not a mighty river by any means, but it was just wide enough to matter. Its banks were steep, the current swift in spring, and on the far side stood the Persian army, perhaps 20,000 strong, mostly cavalry, arranged on higher ground, watching the young Macedonian king with interest. Alexander's generals hesitated. The river was dangerous. Attacking uphill against cavalry, while crossing deep water, was not a sound military plan. Most commanders would have waited, scouted, perhaps lured the enemy into flatter ground. But Alexander was not most commanders. He ordered an immediate attack. He led the charge himself. It was reckless, bold, possibly idiotic, but it worked. The Macedonian cavalry plunged into the river, the phalanx behind them. Fighting uphill, soaked and muddy, they met the Persian horsemen in brutal, chaotic melee. Swords clashed in water. Horses flailed. Men slipped and drowned under hoofs. For a moment, the line wavered. And then Alexander, in gleaming armor, spear in hand, crashed into the Persian left flank. He did not stay in the rear. He never did. He aimed directly for the Persian commanders, decapitating leadership in the most literal sense. Several satraps were killed in the melee. A Persian noble slashed Alexander's helmet with a sword, nearly ending the legend before it truly began. Another officer intervened, just in time, cutting the attacker down. It was not a clean victory, but it was decisive. The Persian cavalry broke. The Macedonians surged forward. The infantry in the rear, mostly Greek mercenaries, were surrounded and massacred, despite offering to surrender. Alexander would later claim it was punishment for their betrayal of the Hellenic cause, but pragmatism also played a role. He didn't want to leave professional soldiers behind him. By the time the sun set on the Granicus, the river ran red, and Alexander had his first real taste of Persian blood. The significance of this battle is often lost in the shadow of his later victories. But in many ways, Granicus was the moment that mattered most. It proved that the Persian armies, despite their numbers and reputation, could be beaten. It showed that Alexander's forces could survive and win on foreign soil. It silenced those in Greece who still doubted the young king's ability. And it forced Darius III, far away in the opulent halls of Persepolis, to start paying attention. More importantly, it set the tone for everything that followed. Alexander's military doctrine was now clear. Move fast, strike first, and never, ever, let fear dictate the battlefield. His troops would cross rivers, climb walls, endure heat, thirst, and exhaustion. And they would do it again, because he would be beside them. It wasn't just courage, it was branding. He understood that kings who sat on horses and pointed were forgotten. But kings who bled, who nearly died, who led from the front and never retreated, those became legends. And Alexander was already building his. In the weeks following the victory, he moved quickly through Asia Minor, securing coastal cities one after another. Some surrendered immediately. Others resisted and were taught the consequences. Temples were visited, tribute collected, governors appointed. The Macedonian grip tightened. Alexander, it seemed, had no intention of stopping. But the battle also revealed something else. He had enemies at home. Demosthenes, the Athenian orator and persistent critic of Macedonian power, reportedly dismissed the Granicus as nothing more than a flashy stunt. The real test, he said, would come later when Darius himself took the field. Alexander, of course, was perfectly fine with that. He was already planning for it. Back at the river, burial rituals were conducted. The Greek dead were honored. The Persian dead were acknowledged. Statues were commissioned in bronze. Letters were sent back to Greece, full of glowing descriptions. And, true to form, Alexander sent 300 suits of captured Persian armor to the Parthenon in Athens, with an inscription that read, "From Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, excluding the Spartans, to the gods who preside over victory." It was a victory, but more importantly, it was his victory. His name first, his army's name second. The exclusion of Sparta, though seemingly petty, was very deliberate. They had refused to join the League of Corinth. Now they were being left out of the story. Alexander didn't just conquer with spears. He conquered with narrative. And Granicus was the prologue. It wasn't the biggest battle he would fight. It wasn't even the bloodiest. But it was the first time the world saw what he could do and what he was willing to risk. A river, a charge, a reckless king in shining armor, crashing into an empire with nothing but ambition and audacity. And behind him, thousands more ready to follow. By 333 BCE, Alexander was no longer just a Macedonian king stomping through coastal cities. He was a growing problem, one that Persia could no longer afford to ignore. After the battle at Granicus and his swift sweep across Asia Minor, satraps had fallen, fortresses had surrendered, and the great king of Persia, Darius III, was finally ready to respond. The Persian Empire, vast and fragmented, did not move quickly. It was a machine of many parts. Satraps with their own agendas, distant provinces with divided loyalties, and royal armies that took months to gather. But eventually they moved, and when they did, they gathered near the coastal plains of Cilicia in the narrow bottleneck between mountains and sea. The place was called Issus. It was here, among the swamps and narrow plains, that Darius III himself marched to meet the Macedonian upstart. It was personal now. The great king of kings, the ruler of the largest empire on earth, had finally decided to show up. And he brought an army with him, perhaps over 100,000 men, maybe more. Ancient sources inflate the numbers, as they always do. What matters is this. Darius had numbers, cavalry, chariots, elephants, and the weight of empire. Alexander had about 40,000 troops and no intention of retreating. What happened next was not strategy. It was geography. Darius, in his eagerness to trap Alexander between river and mountain, made a misstep. He marched his enormous army through a narrow coastal pass and suddenly found himself in a place where his numerical superiority meant very little. The battlefield at Issus was too tight. His troops were cramped, his chariots useless, his advantage dissolved into confusion, and Alexander, as always, took full advantage. The night before battle, he made sacrifices to the gods. He walked among his men. He reminded them that they were not fighting a satrap now, not some local commander or hired mercenaries. They were facing Darius himself. And behind Darius, the entire Persian world. For the first time, the Macedonians would fight the king of kings. And for the first time, that king would run. The battle began as many did. Arrows, cavalry skirmishes, probing thrusts. The Persian right flank pressed hard against Alexander's left, putting the Thessalian cavalry under immense pressure. But Alexander didn't panic. He rarely did. Instead, he led a direct assault with his companion cavalry, targeting the Persian center. More specifically, the position where Darius himself sat in a lavish war chariot, surrounded by guards, banners, and enough gold to shame a temple. Alexander's aim was simple. Don't just win, shatter the myth. He charged. The center of the Persian line crumbled under the momentum of the Macedonian spearheads. And then, as chaos spread through his ranks, Darius III fled the battlefield, abandoning not only his army, but also his family, his wife, daughters, and even his own mother. The image of the king of kings turning his chariot and riding away while his men died around him became the stuff of propaganda gold. Alexander pursued, of course, but night fell, and Darius vanished into the darkness, leaving his empire and his dignity behind. The aftermath was almost stranger than the battle itself. Alexander walked into Darius's tent. It was enormous, gilded, and filled with luxuries. Tapestries, perfumes, servants, golden basins, a full portable palace. His generals were stunned. Some thought they had conquered Persia already, simply by stepping inside. But the most delicate matter lay in the corner of the tent, shivering behind veils and cushions. Darius's wife and mother, who had expected to be slaughtered. Instead, Alexander offered them respect. He bowed. He assured them of their safety. He provided them food and guards and insisted they be treated like royalty, not conquered prisoners. To the Persians, this was unheard of. To the Greeks, it was tactful. To Alexander, it was branding. He was not just a conqueror. He was a new kind of king, one who respected royal blood, even as he claimed their crown. But not everything was so restrained. Alexander took Darius's wife, reportedly the most beautiful woman in Asia, into his household. Some sources claim he never touched her. Others suggest otherwise. Either way, the message was clear. The king had fled, and Alexander now held his family. This was no longer about battles. It was personal. Darius, humiliated, sent a letter. He offered peace, land, gold, the return of his family in exchange for withdrawal. Alexander read the letter and, according to tradition, laughed. He dictated his own reply. Not only would he not return anything, but from now on, Darius should stop calling himself king in their correspondence. There could only be one king of Asia, and Alexander had decided it was him. This wasn't just a military turning point, it was psychological. Up until Issus, Alexander had been a nuisance to the Persian elite, an unusually talented barbarian with a sharp sword and sharper cheekbones. But after Issus, he was something else. He had faced the King of Kings and won. Not with tricks, not with betrayal, with raw, brilliant, terrifying speed. And Darius had fled. Persian morale trembled. Greek morale soared. Even in cities not yet conquered, governors began to question their loyalties. What kind of empire allowed its king to abandon his army, his people, his own blood? What kind of king did that? And what kind of man chased him across the mountains? Issus also marked the beginning of something deeper in Alexander's mind. The idea that perhaps he deserved more than conquest. Perhaps he was more than a king. The people of Persia had knelt before Darius because he was divinely chosen. But now, they had seen a man defeat that divine order. What if Alexander was not merely immortal? What if this was destiny? Not conquest, but transformation? He didn't say this out loud. Not yet, but it began there, on that battlefield soaked with blood and broken flags. The first time he touched the throne of Asia. The first time he felt what it was like to take a crown from a man too afraid to hold it. Issus was not the end. It wasn't even the climax. But it was the moment Alexander stopped chasing his father's dream and began building his own. One kingdom had fallen, a second had fled, and now an empire trembled. After Issus, Alexander was no longer chasing Persia. He was consuming it. But instead of plunging straight into Mesopotamia, he turned south. The reasons were not emotional, they were strategic. To defeat the Persian Empire, you didn't just conquer cities and armies. You took the coastline. You cut off its ports, collapsed its trade, and most importantly, destroyed its fleet by leaving it nowhere to dock. And so Alexander marched along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, sweeping through Phoenician cities like a storm dressed in bronze. Most surrendered with flattering smiles and well-timed gifts. Others did not. The most infamous among them was Tyre. The island city of Tyre was not just wealthy. It was arrogant, built half a mile off the coast, surrounded by thick walls rising directly from the sea. It was considered unassailable. For centuries, it had resisted sieges and defied empires. Its people were traders, navigators, and survivors. And when Alexander arrived in 332 BCE and asked, politely enough, for entry to perform a sacrifice in their temple to Melkart, whom he equated with Heracles, they refused. They didn't say no rudely. They just said no like people who believe in their own invincibility. And in doing so, they made a mistake. Because Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was a man who took denial personally. He didn't rage. He didn't threaten. He simply nodded, turned to his engineers, and said something along the lines of, "We'll walk there then." Which is absurd, of course, because you can't walk to an island. Unless, of course, you build a causeway, a massive stone bridge across half a kilometer of sea, under constant fire from archers and siege engines, while managing an army and a fleet and keeping the rest of the coastline from exploding behind you. So that's exactly what he did. The siege of Tyre lasted 7 months. It was brutal. It was exhausting. It was by most military logic unnecessary. But Alexander would not back down. He brought in ships from the surrendered Phoenician ports. He deployed siege towers on floating platforms. He reinforced the causeway day after day, hauling debris, timber, and stone into the waves, inching closer. The Tyrians fought back with equal brilliance. They sent divers to dismantle underwater supports, They launched fire ships to destroy siege platforms. At one point, they built a giant bronze-tipped chain underwater to snap the mass of Alexander's ships. They were defending their city, yes, but they were also performing for history. And for a while, it seemed the island might hold. But Alexander adapted. He widened the causeway. He rotated his fleet. And then, one final breach, backed by siege towers and a thunderous naval bombardment, cracked the Great Walls. Macedonian troops poured in. The aftermath was not kind. Alexander was furious. Furious that the siege had lasted so long. Furious that Tyre had dared resist. And so he let the soldiers off the leash. Over 6,000 Tyrians were killed. Another 30,000 were enslaved. Only a few, those who had taken shelter in the temples, were spared. The city that thought it could not fall had not only fallen, it had been shattered. And yet, as always, Alexander spared the symbols. The temple of Melkart was left intact. Sacrifices were made. Public prayers offered. And in doing so, Alexander subtly reminded the world, I do not destroy gods. I become them. He stayed just long enough for the message to settle, then turned south again toward Gaza. Now, Gaza was no island, but it was a fortress set on a high hill with thick walls and Persian troops who, by now, were well aware of what happened to cities that resisted Alexander. And still, they resisted. The city was well defended. The commander, Battus, was a loyal Persian who believed in the walls, the gods, and the old empire. Perhaps he thought Alexander wouldn't have the patience to siege another stronghold so soon. Perhaps he hoped Darius would arrive to break the siege. Neither happened. Alexander, still recovering from wounds at Tyre, rode up to the city walls and ordered preparations. The ground was soft and sandy, but he had his engineers build massive ramps to the base of the walls. Siege towers were rolled forward, and once again, the assault began. The siege lasted 2 months. Not as long as Tyre, but long enough to try Alexander's patience. When the walls finally fell, Gaza suffered the same fate as Tyre, but with one crucial difference. Battus was taken alive. And here, the story gets darker. Alexander, it seems, did not forgive men who made him bleed. He had been wounded during the siege, an arrow to the shoulder, and he did not forget it. When Battus was dragged before him, refusing to kneel, Alexander reportedly ordered a punishment both theatrical and horrific. He had Battus tied by the heels to a chariot and dragged around the city walls until he died. It was a deliberate echo of Achilles punishing Hector, except this was no poetic metaphor. It was politics, cruelty, and a warning. After Gaza, the southern coast was his. Egypt stood next, and unlike Tyre or Gaza, Egypt welcomed him. But that comes later. What mattered most in the sieges of Tyre and Gaza wasn't the strategic gain, though that was considerable. It wasn't even the spectacle of walls falling and cities burning. It was the idea that Alexander, this young king from the north, had become inevitable. He didn't simply win battles. He broke cities that had never fallen. He walked across water. He dragged men through sand. And then, with blood still wet on his hands, he walked into temples and offered sacrifices, as if to say, yes, I did this. And the gods approved. These sieges reshaped how the world saw him. Before, he had been a conqueror. After, he was something far more unsettling, a force. To resist him was to delay the inevitable. To deny him was to invite destruction. And to surrender, well, that was just another way to join the legend. By the end of 332 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean belonged to Alexander. The walls had fallen. The gods had been acknowledged. The message had been delivered. No distance would stop him. No fortress would hold. No general would stand. And soon, not even an empire would survive. After the blood-soaked sieges of Tyre and Gaza, Alexander might have been forgiven for needing a break. 2 grueling campaigns, thousands of corpses, and a chariot execution or 2 could exhaust even the most determined conqueror. But rest was not in his nature. And as winter of 332 BCE approached, he turned his gaze south to Egypt, the land of pyramids and prophecy, of Nile and priests. had been under Persian control for nearly 2 centuries. But control is a generous term. The Persians had ruled Egypt the way a landlord rules a crumbling estate, remotely, occasionally, and with little understanding of its culture. The Egyptians, ever pragmatic, obeyed, but never liked it. Darius III was just another foreign king, one in a long line of distant men who called themselves pharaoh, but never acted like one. So when Alexander entered Egyptian territory, something unusual happened. The people didn't resist. They welcomed him. No walls, no siege engines, no burning temples, just open gates, respectful offerings, and a deep sigh of relief. To the Egyptians, Alexander was not just a liberator. He was the anti-Persian. Young, powerful, victorious, he had humiliated their rulers, burned their ships, and seemed oddly interested in their gods. What more could you want in a foreign conqueror? Alexander played the part well. He visited shrines, paid tribute to Isis and Osiris, and acted not as a foreign king, but as a curious guest. And the Egyptian priests, masters of ritual and adaptation, saw something familiar in him, a man of divine destiny, a child of unusual birth, a figure draped in myth. They knew how to read that kind of man, so they gave him a new name, son of Ammonius. Now, this might sound dramatic, and it was, but for Alexander, it was a perfectly logical next step in his slow metamorphosis from mortal king to something more radiant. Ammonius was the supreme deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Fused with the sun god Ra, pharaohs had long claimed divine descent from Ammonius to justify their rule. Alexander didn't invent the idea. He simply embraced it with more flair. He visited the temple of Ammonius at Siwa Oasis, a remote sanctuary deep in the Libyan desert. The journey alone was treacherous, and legend claims he was guided by serpents or ravens, or perhaps just his own confidence. When he arrived, the high priest greeted him not as a visitor, but as something more. According to some sources, the priest hailed him in Greek, O Paidios Dios, which can mean, O son of Zeus. Whether it was a misunderstanding, a convenient coincidence, or a calculated move, Alexander did not correct him. In fact, he leaned into it. The priest entered the oracle chamber. No one knows what was said. Alexander never revealed the full prophecy. But when he emerged, his face was different. The soldiers said he smiled, calmly, distantly. When asked what the oracle had told him, he simply said, "It will be as foretold." And from that day forward, the legend grew. Alexander was not just king of Macedonia, not just ruler of Egypt. He was the son of God. This divine branding served many purposes. In Egypt, it solidified his authority. In Persia, it mirrored Darius's claims to divinity. Among his troops, it inspired awe, or at the very least, made disobedience feel spiritually risky. And to Alexander himself, it likely felt natural. He had always been different, always destined, but even gods need cities. And so, in early 331 BCE, Alexander founded one, Alexandria. It was not the first city he'd established in his name, nor would it be the last, but it was the most important. Situated on the Mediterranean coast, near the western edge of the Nile Delta, the site was perfect, a natural harbor, access to inland trade routes, and proximity to both Greek and Egyptian centers of power. It was in every way a statement. He didn't stay to build it. Gods rarely stick around for construction, but he chose the site, ordered the layout, and handed the plans to his architects. The city would have wide streets, massive temples, grand libraries, and a lighthouse that would one day become one of the 7 wonders of the world. It would speak Greek, think like a philosopher, and worship like an Egyptian. A fusion, a monument, a city built not just for living, but for remembering. Alexandria would outlive him. Long after his bones turned to dust, the city would become the beating heart of Mediterranean learning and commerce. But for now, it was just another mark on a map, one of many seeds he planted in the name of permanence. And then, he left. Egypt, though significant, was not the final goal. It was a stepping stone, a place to rest, refuel, be crowned and deified. But Persia still stood. Darius still breathed, and Alexander, no matter how many titles or temples he claimed, would not be satisfied until he stood at the very center of the empire he had come to destroy. He left a trusted general to govern Egypt, placed garrisons to protect trade routes, and marched east, back into the heart of war. But something had shifted. Before Egypt, he had been a king, a general, a brilliant, ambitious force of nature. After Egypt, he was something else. He now claimed divine status. He expected worship. He believed, not just outwardly, but inwardly, that he was chosen. He had spoken with oracles, worn the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He had founded a city, received a new name, and been embraced by a civilization older than anything he'd known. The sands of the Nile had wrapped around his legend and refused to let go. Some of his men were uneasy. The Greeks, especially, didn't like the whole "I might be a god now" direction. But they said nothing yet. Alexander had become too powerful, too victorious, too inevitable. To question him now was to question the victories that had brought them all here. And so, Egypt became part of the myth. A chapter in the story that made him immortal. A chapter filled not with battles, but with meaning. Alexander had proven he could conquer cities. Now he proved he could conquer faith. And with the desert wind behind him and a new title carved into his mind, he marched once more into the unknown. This time, not just as a king, but as a god in the making. By the autumn of 331 BCE, Alexander had become more than just a thorn in Persia's side. He was the thorn, the blade, the flame, and, depending on whom you asked, the beginning of the end. He had defeated local governors, razed ancient cities, been declared son of a god in Egypt, and was now marching east with no sign of slowing down. The Persian Empire had stumbled, wavered, lost battle after battle, but it had not yet fallen. Not completely. Darius III still lived. And so, Alexander set out to finish the job. Darius, for his part, had learned something from the humiliation at Issus. He would not wait passively in a mountain pass. He would not let geography decide his fate. This time, he chose the battlefield. It was a place called Gaugamela, meaning the camel's house in the old tongue. A flat, open plain near the Tigris River. Perfect terrain for cavalry, chariots, and maneuvering large forces. Which was exactly what Darius had in mind. He had the numbers. He had the space. He had even ordered the ground to be cleared and leveled so his war chariots wouldn't hit a bump and embarrass him in front of the gods again. This was to be his redemption, his masterpiece, his revenge. According to ancient sources, Darius assembled an army of unimaginable size, possibly up to 250,000 soldiers, though modern estimates are far lower. Still, it was massive. Cavalry from Bactria and Scythia, Indian war elephants, chariots with blades on their wheels, infantry in glittering armor, drums, trumpets, banners whipping in the desert wind. It was more than a military force. It was theater, and at the center of it all sat Darius himself, high on a golden chariot, surrounded by guards and symbols of empire. He had prepared everything, that is, except for Alexander. Alexander arrived with his now seasoned army, about 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, tired from a march but trained to the bone. Veterans of Tyre, Issus, Gaza, men who had built causeways through the sea and dragged siege towers across deserts. He camped close enough to see the Persian torches flickering at night. He knew what was coming. Before the battle, he offered sacrifice. He gave speeches. He promised land, titles, wealth, if they won. And if they lost? Well, no one really discussed that. Not out loud. Then came the dawn. On the morning of the Battle of Gaugamela, the desert was silent. The sun climbed slowly, casting long shadows on the dust. The Persians stretched across the horizon. It was not a line, it was a wall. A glittering, terrifying wall. And Alexander, with far fewer troops, did not flinch. He arranged his army in a long, thin line, with reserves in the rear and light cavalry on the flanks. But unlike Darius, Alexander wasn't interested in showmanship. He was interested in movement. As the battle began, he didn't charge forward. He angled right, pulling his cavalry wide, forcing Darius to stretch his own lines further and further. The Persians, confused, began to shift, trying to block the maneuver. And that's when Alexander struck. In a sudden burst, he and his companion cavalry pivoted inward, cutting diagonally across the battlefield, straight for the Persian center, straight for Darius. The shock was devastating. The Persian line buckled. Alexander's infantry surged forward. Dust choked the air. Horses screamed. Spears splintered. And somewhere in that chaos, Darius looked around and realized, once again, that he was about to become a very expensive liability. And so, for the second and final time, Darius fled. He didn't wait to see the outcome. He didn't rally his men. He simply turned his chariot and disappeared into the heat, leaving his empire behind. Without their king, the Persian troops crumbled. Some resisted. Many ran. A few were cut down and retreat. Others, especially the mercenaries, tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons, shouting in languages their killers didn't understand. By the end of the day, the battlefield was covered in corpses, armor, and broken standards. The Persian Empire, for all practical purposes, had collapsed. Alexander had won. Not just a battle, not just a war. He had won Asia, and yet he did not celebrate. Not in the way one might expect. He pursued Darius briefly, but the king vanished again into the hinterlands. He looted the Persian camp. Of course, there was gold, treasure, silk, spices. He captured Darius's royal carriage, complete with family emblems, scrolls, and official seals. Then he turned toward Babylon. When he entered the city, it did not resist. It opened its gates, showered him with flowers, hailed him as King of Kings. The same title once reserved for Darius. The same title that had echoed through Achaemenid palaces for generations. It now belonged to a Macedonian. Alexander made sacrifices to local gods. He adopted Persian customs. He issued edicts in multiple languages. He understood something Darius never had. To rule Persia, you must become Persia. And so began his transformation, not just from king to emperor, but from Macedonian conqueror to something far more hybrid, far more complicated. But Gaugamela remained the moment it all became real. It was the final exam, the ultimate test, the moment when Alexander didn't just defeat a man, he dismantled a civilization. It had all the ingredients of legend: courage, risk, betrayal, and flight. The general who charged into the heart of an empire. The king who ran twice. The battlefield that decided the fate of two worlds. To the Greeks, it was the ultimate revenge. To the Persians, it was the end of an era. To Alexander, it was the fulfillment of a prophecy he'd been whispering to himself since childhood. He was now, officially, what he had always believed himself to be, Lord of Asia. But there was still one problem. Darius was not yet dead, and Alexander, god or not, could not bear an unfinished story. That would have to wait for another chapter. But for now, the dust settled. The banners fell. The stars shifted. And the boy from Pella stood, at last, on top of the world. Chapter 3. Eastern Expansion, India and Empire Management. The farther Alexander marched east, the less the world resembled anything he had known. Cities bore names no Greek could pronounce. Customs blurred between myth and ritual. The stars shifted overhead, and the rivers no longer whispered, they roared. By 326 BCE, he had crossed Persia, burned palaces, collected satraps like trinkets, and declared himself King of Kings. But one great mystery still waited. India, the land beyond the industry, the edge of what the Greeks called the world ocean, a place of golden rumors, exotic beasts, and, allegedly, a race of people who slept on the ground and had no need for fire. Alexander, of course, had no intention of turning back. He led his army into the Punjab, through heat and jungle, rain and fog. The further they moved, the more their Greek cloaks rotted, their sandals fell apart, and their patience wore thin. But Alexander pressed on, eyes lit with the same hunger that had driven him across Asia. Somewhere beyond the horizon, he was sure, waited another king, another crown, another version of himself to be consumed. He found in Porus, Horus was not like the other kings Alexander had faced. He did not flee. He did not send envoys with apologies and tribute. He stood and waited, proud and towering, a ruler of the land of the Hydaspes River, now known as the Jalem. He had war-trained elephants, giants clad in armor, tusks sharpened, howdahs mounted with archers and spear-wielders. He had infantry hardened by jungle war, and he had the river. The Hydaspes was no mere obstacle. It was wide, fast, and swollen from monsoon rains. Crossing it, under the eyes of an enemy prepared to crush you the moment your sandals touched mud, would have been suicide for any ordinary general. But Alexander was not ordinary. He studied the river. He observed Porus's camp. He waited for storms. Then, one night, beneath pounding rain and thunder, he took a portion of his army upstream under cover of darkness. Lightning flashed, thunder roared, and in the chaos of nature's fury, he crossed. It was not elegant. Men drowned. Horses panicked. Boats were overturned. But they made it. They emerged on the far bank at dawn, wet, exhausted but alive. And Porus, caught off guard, suddenly found his perfect defensive position shattered. Still, he didn't panic. He marched out to meet Alexander, elephants in front, infantry behind. It was a wall of beasts and steel, and the ground shook as they approached. The Macedonians had never seen anything like it. Many had never even heard of war elephants. These were not the decorative creatures shown in Persian carvings. These were weapons, tusks plated in bronze, eyes wide with fury, capable of flipping chariots and crushing men with one stomp. The battle began in the mud. Alexander, as always, moved like water. He sent his cavalry to harass the flanks, baiting the Indian horsemen into overextending. His archers rained arrows on the elephants, not to kill them, but to enrage them. He ordered his phalanx to stay tight, to absorb the charge, to let the elephants crash into a wall of spears and shields. The elephants charged anyway. What followed was chaos. Screaming men, trumpeting beasts, armor clattering in the monsoon mist. Some Macedonians were trampled, their lines broken by sheer force. But others held. They jabbed at the elephants' eyes, slashed at their legs. The Macedonian archers circled, picking off the riders on top. Slowly, painfully, the animals began to falter. The battle raged for hours. Porus, astride his own elephant, fought with grim determination. He was wounded. His army, overwhelmed, finally began to collapse. But he refused to retreat. He stood on his elephant, drenched in blood and rain, watching as his warriors fell around him. Finally, surrounded and outnumbered, he was captured. Alexander, ever theatrical, approached the defeated king with the dramatic flair of a man who knew he was living inside a future legend. He looked up at Porus, still towering on his wounded elephant, and asked, "How would you wish to be treated?" Porus, proud to the end, replied, "Like a king." And so Alexander did. He didn't humiliate Porus. He didn't chain him or strip him of his throne. Instead, he let him keep his kingdom and even expanded it, because Alexander understood something many rulers never did. You don't break a man like Porus. You honor him, and in doing so, make him your symbol. It was a rare moment of mercy in a life defined by conquest. But the victory came at a cost. The Macedonian army, already stretched thin and sick of monsoons, saw the elephants, the jungle, the rain, and said, "Enough." They were done. They had marched for years, fought in deserts, scaled mountains, burned cities. They had followed Alexander across rivers and through lies. But here, on the edge of a world they did not understand, they finally stopped. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, modern Bios, they refused to go further. Alexander was furious. He wept. He raged. He sulked in his tent for 3 days. This was not how legends were supposed to end. There was more to conquer, more names to carve into stone, more stories to tell. But the army didn't move. Not this time. He relented. They built 12 altars to mark the eastern edge of the empire. Massive structures to symbolize that they had reached the ends of the earth. And then they turned around. Not defeated, but changed. Hydaspes had been a victory, a magnificent one. But it was also the beginning of an ending. Alexander would continue. There would be more cities, more blood, more gods and dreams. But the East, India, remained unfinished. A mystery, a frontier he would never truly conquer. He had faced elephants, defied rivers, fought through storms. And for once, the world had fought back, not with defeat, but with limits. He had crossed the known world, but the world at last had drawn a line. Alexander the Great had conquered more than any man before him. He had crushed the Persian Empire, walked into Babylon without a fight, crossed the Hindu Kush, and defeated kings who rode on elephants. He had been crowned pharaoh in Egypt, called the son of Zeus Ammon, and declared Lord of Asia. Cities fell before him. Priests bowed. Mountains trembled. But at the banks of a muddy river in northern India, in the monsoon heat, it was his own army that said no. The river was the Hyphasis, modern-day Bias. It wasn't particularly wide or legendary. No oracle spoke of it. It didn't guard any known empire or throne. It was just another river to cross, another dot on Alexander's expanding map. But to the men who had marched from Macedonia to this distant edge of the world, the Hyphasis represented something far more intimidating than any battlefield: the end of human endurance. Let us remember what they had endured. These were men who had followed Alexander for nearly a decade. They had crossed deserts, scaled mountains, fought in choking dust, and under torrential monsoon rains. They had starved. They had bled. They had watched comrades die in foreign lands, far from the olive groves and wine-dark seas of home. They had built siege engines by hand, stormed island cities, stared down war elephants, and buried their leaders. They had left behind families, identities, and nearly all sense of where they were going. And Alexander, brilliant, magnetic, untiring Alexander, had never once slowed down. Now, standing on yet another bank, with talk of further conquests beyond the Ganges, against kingdoms even he had never seen, the army broke. The revolt began in silence. No open mutiny, no spears thrown down, just refusal. One man sat, then another, then 100, then thousands. Campfires burned, but the mood had shifted. Alexander summoned his officers. He raged. He argued. He promised riches, land, eternal fame. He pointed east and claimed that only a few more steps lay between them and the edge of the world. They listened, respectfully, reverently even. Then they said no. It was not cowardice. It was not betrayal. It was human. Alexander, for the first time in his adult life, was faced with a battle he could not win. Not with cavalry charges, not with rhetoric, not even with divine status. His men were done, and without them, he was just a very ambitious man with a map and a lot of dreams. According to legend, he sulked for 3 days inside his tent. He refused to eat, refused to speak. He paced like a trapped lion, furious not just at his men, but at the realization that his will had limits. That even kings who believed themselves descended from gods could not rewrite the endurance of flesh and blood. On the 4th day, he emerged, and to the shock of many, he agreed. They would go no farther east. The world, for now, would remain unconquered. But if Alexander could not move forward, he would not simply turn back like a defeated man. He built 12 massive altars along the riverbank, altars to the gods of Olympus, to Heracles, to himself. They were enormous, towering structures meant to say, "We reached this far and no farther." They were half religion, half propaganda, carved into the land like a bronze footprint. Then came the journey home, if one can call it that. Instead of retracing their steps through the known paths of Persia, Alexander decided, of course, to chart a new route. He would lead a portion of his army south, down the Indus River, through hostile territories that had never heard of Macedon. The rest of the army would follow a more manageable course westward, while Alexander's fleet sailed along the river. What followed was not glorious. It was brutal. The retreat turned into a campaign. Villages resisted and were destroyed. Local kings fought and were subdued. A city named Multan was captured after fierce resistance, but not before Alexander himself was wounded by an arrow in the chest, collapsing with blood in his lungs. For a moment, his army believed he was dead. Panic spread. Rumors multiplied. But days later, Alexander reappeared, bandaged, pale, and furious at the idea of his own mortality. He refused to be carried. He insisted on walking. And so, half dead, half myth, he led them on. Eventually, they reached the sea. At last, the eastern edge of the campaign had come. But the return journey still lay ahead, and Alexander chose the hardest way possible, the Gedrosian Desert. It was a death march. The desert was dry beyond reason, scattered with rocks, poisoned wells, and the skeletal remains of failed caravans. There was no water, no shelter, and little mercy. Alexander led from the front, refusing extra rations, sharing what little water he had with his men. At one point, when a helmet of water was brought to him, precious enough to ransom a kingdom, he poured it out into the sand in front of his troops, saying he would not drink unless all could. It was dramatic. It was foolish. It was unforgettable. Thousands died. By the time the army reached civilization again, it was half of what it had been. Starved, scarred, changed. But they had followed him all the way. When they reached Babylon in 324 BCE, it was not with the cheers of returning heroes. It was with the silence of survivors. Alexander had not lost a battle, not once. But at the hyphasis, something more profound had happened. He had been refused, not by kings, not by armies, but by exhaustion itself. And in that moment, we see not just the myth of Alexander, but the man, the one who wept for more worlds to conquer, only to learn that even ambition has an end. That empires are not built by destiny alone, but by men with blistered feet and broken morale. That even legends, when stretched too thin, begin to unravel. He had stared down Persian kings, faced war elephants, built cities in deserts, and demanded to be worshipped as a god. But on the banks of a river in India, it was his army, mud-soaked, weary, and still loyal, that told him the truth no oracle ever dared speak. This far and no farther. Alexander had conquered Persia. Darius was dead. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis had all opened their gates or watched them burn. The empire was his. And yet, as the dust of conquest settled, Alexander found himself staring at a more difficult challenge: governing. Taking an empire is one thing. Holding it is something else entirely, especially when that empire stretches from the Mediterranean to the edge of India and is stitched together by dozens of languages, religions, rival dynasties, and enough generational resentment to last several lifetimes. And so, Alexander did something unexpected, something neither wholly Macedonian nor Persian. He decided to fuse the two worlds, not through swords or taxes, but through marriage. It was ambitious. It was idealistic. It was, frankly, a little unhinged. But in the spring of 324 BCE, in the grand Persian capital of Susa, Alexander staged what might be the most extraordinary mass wedding in ancient history. Historians refer to it now, with a mixture of awe and skepticism, as the Susa weddings. Here's how it went. Alexander took 92 of his top officers, many of whom had served with him for years, and arranged for them to marry Persian noblewomen. Not just any women, of course, but daughters of high-ranking Persian families, the very bloodlines that once opposed him. It was politics, diplomacy, and romance by royal decree. Alexander himself led by example. He married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, the very man he had defeated. He also married Persides, the daughter of Artaxerxes III, another dead Persian king. 2 wives, both with claims to royal legitimacy. If lineage were a game, Alexander was stacking the deck. It wasn't just about love. It wasn't even mostly about love. This was symbolism in its most extravagant form. The message was clear. We are no longer conquerors and conquered. We are one people, united, intermarried, intertwined, Macedonian soldiers and Persian princesses. One empire, one family. Except, that's not how the Macedonians saw it. To them, Persia was exotic, unfamiliar, and still, in many eyes, the enemy. These were men who had spent years hacking their way across Asia, burning cities, trampling temples, watching friends die to Persian arrows. Now, suddenly, they were being told to don Persian robes, speak Persian names, and marry women they'd never met. All in the name of unity? It was a lot to take in. Even the weddings themselves were overwhelming. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall of Susa, decorated with silk banners, gold braziers, and incense from every corner of the empire. The grooms wore hybrid costumes, half Greek, half Persian. The brides were veiled, painted, wrapped in wealth. Music played. Priests prayed in several languages. And when it was done, a feast began. A 5-day feast, complete with games, sacrifices, music, dancing, and generous helpings of wine. It was excessive, ostentatious, possibly divine. Alexander walked among the guests like a living god, smiling, blessing unions, reminding everyone that this blending of worlds was not just spectacle. It was strategy. And to be fair, some saw the brilliance of it. The Persian nobility felt respected. Their daughters became queens. Their bloodlines were preserved. Their honor restored. Many of them accepted the marriages with genuine relief. But for the Macedonians, it was more complicated. Many resented being forced into unions that were arranged without consent, without affection. Others saw it as a betrayal of their culture. Macedonian customs were military, rough, direct. Persian court life was steeped in ritual, hierarchy, and perfume. The fusion was not natural. It was enforced. And there was another problem. These marriages were never meant to be permanent. Within a year of Alexander's death, most of the Macedonian officers abandoned their Persian wives. The weddings had never been about family. They were about optics. And once the empire began to splinter, so too did the bonds that were never really forged. But at the time, on those 5 days in Susa, it all looked perfect. Alexander believed in the vision. Or at least, he acted like he did. He dreamed of a new elite, children born of both bloodlines, raised with Greek learning and Persian elegance. A ruling class that could straddle both worlds, uniting East and West not just by sword, but by shared ancestry. It was audacious, impressive, some might say impossible, but that was Alexander in his final years, a man building something bigger than empire. He no longer wanted to rule Persia. He wanted to become Persia, without ever ceasing to be Macedonian. He sat on golden thrones, but read Homer by lamplight. He bowed to Zoroastrian fire altars, but sacrificed to Zeus. He wore purple robes stitched in Babylon, but kept Achilles' dagger by his bed. He was both, and neither. And in the Susa weddings, he tried to remake the world in his own image. But the world does not always follow vision. Back in Macedon, the old nobility bristled. In the army, old friendships began to sour. The officers Alexander had trusted for years whispered behind his back. The cracks in loyalty began not in battle, but in marriage. Because not every man wanted to be part of a legend. Some just wanted to go home. And yet, the Susa weddings remain one of the most fascinating moments in the Alexander saga. A moment when war paused, when an empire dressed itself in silk and gold and tried, however briefly, to believe in peace. Not because the fighting was over, but because the man who had won everything was now trying to redefine victory. Alexander was no longer content with conquest. He wanted to fuse civilizations, to erase the lines he had spent years crossing. And for 5 strange days in Susa, beneath lanterns and music, with goblets in hand and gods watching from every corner of the empire, it looked like he might just succeed. One of the most enduring legacies of Alexander the Great is not carved in marble or forged in bronze, but drawn across maps in neat little circles, each bearing the same familiar name, Alexandria. It sounds dramatic, of course, and it was. By the end of his campaigns, Alexander had established, or at least ordered the establishment of, more than 20 cities bearing his name. Some rose in deserts, others near rivers. Some survived centuries, others vanished within decades, swallowed by dust or conquest. But all of them, for one shining moment, were meant to be something more than just garrisons or settlements. They were meant to be seeds, planted across Asia to grow a new civilization. But why so many Alexandrias? The answer, as with all things in Alexander's life, lies somewhere between ego and strategy. To be clear, it was not uncommon for ancient kings to name cities after themselves. But 20? That takes commitment, or vanity, or both. Let's start with the most famous one, Alexandria in Egypt. Founded in 331 BCE near the western edge of the Nile Delta, this was not just a military outpost. It was a vision. Alexander himself chose the site, flat, breezy, perched between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis. According to legend, he sketched its layout in the sand with a sword, because chalk was for lesser men. The city would have broad avenues, orderly grids, monumental harbors, and temples to both Greek and Egyptian gods. A lighthouse would one day shine here, one of the seven wonders. A library would rise, housing the world's knowledge. The Ptolemies, his successors in Egypt, would make it the jewel of the Mediterranean. But back in Alexander's lifetime, it was still just a blueprint, a promise, a city in the sand, and he kept building them. There was Alexandria Escate, Alexandria the furthest, founded in modern-day Tajikistan, an outpost at the edge of the known world, surrounded by mountains and mystery. Here, Macedonian soldiers mixed with Sogdian locals, intermarried, and built homes with both Greek columns and Persian arches. A city built more for defense than culture, but a foothold nonetheless. There were Alexandrias in Arachosia, in Carmania, in Susiana, in Bactria, in Aria, each named with the same self-assured certainty. Each designed to be a node in an empire where Greek culture and local traditions would, somehow, coexist peacefully. Some are merely fortified camps given a fancy name. Others became thriving cities with theaters, temples, gymnasiums, and marketplaces. In all of them, Greek language was encouraged, Greek coins were minted, and Greek gods were introduced, though often wearing local clothes. It was urban planning as imperial propaganda. But there was more to it. These cities were not just about naming things after himself. Though, let's be honest, that was part of it. They were about creating order, about ensuring that the lands he conquered would not remain wild or rebellious or ungovernable. A city was a message. A city said, this land belongs to someone. There are laws here, markets, temples, soldiers, bureaucrats, tax collectors, sculptors. Each Alexandria was a dot on a growing network of control. They housed veterans from his army, men too old or wounded to keep marching. Instead of returning them home, Alexander gave them homes here, with land and wives and civic responsibilities. In doing so, he created little pockets of loyalty scattered throughout the empire. They were his eyes, his ears, his legacy in stone. And then there was the cultural aspect. Alexander believed, truly, perhaps madly, that Greek civilization was the highest form of human expression, that it was his destiny to spread it, not just through conquest, but through architecture, language, and philosophy. He wanted cities with schools, where Aristotle's teachings could be read in faraway bazaars. Cities with theaters, where Sophocles and Euripides could be performed under unfamiliar stars. Cities with gymnasiums, where young men could train their minds and bodies, not for war, but for excellence. It was a kind of soft power projected by stone and scrolls. Of course, the locals didn't always see it that way. To many Persians, Bactrians, Sogdians, and Indians, these Alexandrias were foreign impositions. Strange cities where statues of alien gods stood beside old temples, where foreign laws applied, where Greek officials made decisions in a tongue not their own. There was resistance, riots, uprisings. Not all cities flourished. Some faded as quickly as they rose. Others became hybrid spaces, neither wholly Greek nor fully native, but something in between. And yet the idea endured. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire fractured almost immediately. His generals, now called the Diadochi, carved up his territories like hungry wolves. But the cities he founded, many remained. Alexandria in Egypt grew into a capital. A lighthouse watched over its harbor. A library welcomed scholars from Athens to India. Philosophers debated. Merchants traded. Languages blended. Even Julius Caesar would visit its marble halls, and later, Napoleon. Other Alexandrias became provincial centers. Some disappeared in wars or earthquakes. Some are modern cities today, wearing new names but still sitting on the bones of Alexander's ambition. There is something strangely human about this. Alexander marched thousands of miles. He crossed rivers and mountains, battled kings, tamed armies, demanded to be worshipped. But what he left behind were not only graves and glory, but grids. Streets, stone, names. He wanted to be remembered, and he is. Not just in epic poems or ruined palaces, but on Google Maps. Click around Central Asia, the Middle East, Northern India. Somewhere, beneath a modern city, you'll find traces of an Alexandria. Maybe a column, a coin, a broken amphora, or maybe just the echo of a name half erased by time. 20 cities. One man, Alexander the Builder, the architect of empire. The king who planted cities like flags and hoped they would take root. Some did, some didn't. But in the end, history remembers. And sometimes, that's all a conqueror can ask. Part 2. The Man Behind the Legend. Chapter 1. Origins and Education. Before the world knew him as a god, before cities bore his name, before statues were raised and legends chiseled into stone, Alexander was just a boy, born into a royal bedchamber that smelled of ambition, incense, and perhaps a touch too much prophecy. The year was 356 BCE. The place was Pella, the ancient capital of Macedon, a dusty kingdom on the northern edge of the Greek-speaking world, often looked down upon by the more refined southern city-states like Athens and Thebes. Macedon was wild, mountainous, and militaristic, ruled not by philosophers but by warlords who wore crowns. And into this world, under the flickering oil lamps of the royal palace, a boy was born to King Philip II and Queen Olympias. His name was Alexandros, meaning defender of men. A strong name, a sharp name, one that would later echo through deserts and oceans alike. But at birth, he was simply the second in a long line of royal children, yet to prove himself, yet to draw blood, yet to command armies. But there was something different about him, even then, or so the stories claim. His mother, Olympias, was not Macedonian by birth. She came from Epirus, a neighboring kingdom to the west, descended from the Meletian royal house, which claimed lineage from the mythical hero Achilles. That's right. Even before Alexander could walk, his mother was whispering into his cradle that he was born of warrior kings and Trojan conquerors. And she believed it. Olympias was a complex woman, brilliant, passionate, intensely devout, and utterly convinced that her son was destined for greatness. She practiced mystery religions, worshipped serpents, and frequently engaged in ecstatic rituals that alarmed even the hardened Macedonian court. To the men who valued armor and horses, Olympias brought incense, dreams, and omens. And then there was Philip the father. If Olympias gave Alexander his dreams, Philip gave him his world. Philip II was no ordinary monarch. He had taken a backward kingdom and turned it into a military machine. His reforms revolutionized warfare. He lengthened the spears of the Macedonian phalanx, trained standing armies with professional rigor, and unified fractious tribes under a single throne. By the time Alexander was old enough to ride a horse, Macedon was already rising to dominate Greece. Philip was brilliant, charismatic, dangerous, a man who built alliances as easily as he destroyed them, a king with a dozen wives and at least as many enemies. But for all his power, Philip saw something in Alexander, a spark perhaps, or a mirror. And yet, the relationship between father and son was complicated. Philip was often away, fighting wars, marrying women, hosting banquets, asserting dominance. Alexander grew up in the shadow of a man who was not just king, but legend in the making. And Olympias, ever vigilant, made sure Alexander knew whose blood truly mattered. Hers, Achilles's, the gods perhaps. It's no surprise, then, that Alexander's sense of destiny was cultivated from the cradle. He was told repeatedly that he was not like other boys, that he was born under special stars, that one day he would do what even Philip could not. There is a famous story, one of many, that on the very night Alexander was born, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground. It was considered one of the great wonders of the ancient world. But on that night, it fell to flames. The reason? According to the later Greek biographer Plutarch, the goddess was too busy attending the birth of Alexander to save her temple. A myth? Certainly, but one that tells you everything about the way this child was regarded. Even in infancy, he grew up in the palace at Pella, surrounded by tutors, philosophers, generals, and a rotating cast of royal intrigue. He was not just educated, he was forged, made to read Homer, study rhetoric, learn languages, and ride horses before most children had stopped teething. By the time he was 10, he had already tamed a horse no one else could control, a wild stallion named Bucephalus, who would later carry him through half the known world. This wasn't just a boy and his pet. It was a symbol. Even in youth, Alexander seemed capable of mastering what others could not. But more on Bucephalus later. The real education would begin when Alexander turned 13. That's when Philip summoned Aristotle, the most celebrated philosopher of his age, and appointed him the prince's personal tutor. Aristotle, student of Plato, teacher of logic, biology, ethics, and metaphysics. A man who would later shape the very foundations of Western thought. And for several years, he was Alexander's private instructor. The arrangement was more than just lessons. Philip built Aristotle a school at Mysa, a peaceful retreat where the young prince could learn among nature, fountains, and trees. It was a strategic move, far from court politics, far from Olympias's rituals, and far from the distractions of palace life. Here, Alexander studied Homer, especially the Iliad, which he took as more than just literature. It was gospel. He saw in Achilles a version of himself, noble, wrathful, destined for glory. He is said to have kept a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, annotated by Aristotle himself. He studied philosophy, science, medicine. He learned the value of reason and debate. And yet, even Aristotle could not contain the boy's growing ambition. Where the philosopher taught balance, Alexander burned for conquest. Where Aristotle pondered ethics, Alexander dreamed of empires. The education was fruitful, but incomplete. The student admired his teacher, but would soon outgrow the classroom. By the time he was 16, Alexander was already acting as regent while Philip waged war. When a northern tribe revolted, Alexander led a campaign to crush them, and founded his first city, Alexandropolis, in the process. Yes, at 16. By 17, he was commanding cavalry in battle. By 18, he helped lead the Macedonian phalanx at Chaeronea, a decisive clash where Greek resistance was finally broken. Legend says that Alexander broke the sacred band of Thebes, a unit of elite warriors bound by both oath and love, earning his first real taste of blood, victory, and irreversible fame. And by 20? Well, by 20, he would become king. But before all that, before the campaigns and the legends and the endless Alexandrias, he was a boy caught between two towering forces, a mother who whispered of gods, and a father who marched like one. He was shaped by shadows and sharpened by greatness. And from the beginning, one thing was clear. Alexander was not born to live quietly. He was born to make the world remember his name. If Philip's sword built Macedon, then Aristotle's words helped shape the boy who would take it far beyond its borders. But let's not pretend this was an easy match. Pairing one of the greatest military prodigies in history with one of the greatest philosophers in Western thought. Sounds perfect, doesn't it? Well, it was complicated. It began around 343 BCE. Alexander was 13, young enough to be impressionable, old enough to start asking dangerous questions. So his father, never one to skimp on legacy, summoned Aristotle from the distant halls of the Lyceum and gave him a task: educate the future ruler of the world. It was a job with perks. Philip provided a leafy sanctuary in Mysa, far from court politics, where Alexander could learn alongside other noble youths, including Ptolemy and Cassander, boys who would later become kings in their own right. Aristotle was given a temple to teach in, a staff of assistants, and presumably the occasional headache. But he didn't teach Alexander like a schoolmaster drilling a bored prince. No, Aristotle believed in form, in structure, in the search for causes, principles, categories. He taught the boy logic, ethics, politics, natural science, metaphysics, and, of course, Homer. It was Homer, above all, who stuck. Alexander wasn't just taught the Iliad. He lived it, slept with it under his pillow, memorized its verses. He saw himself as Achilles reborn, a hero born to conquer, destined to fall gloriously. If Aristotle hoped to encourage critical thinking, Alexander took the myths and turned them into a script for life. This was the curious thing about their relationship. Aristotle tried to teach wisdom, and Alexander took from an ambition. He absorbed not only the facts, but the ideals, and then twisted them into a justification for his own imperial dreams. Take, for example, Aristotle's belief in natural hierarchy, that some people were born to rule and others to be ruled. It was a fairly standard Greek opinion at the time, but Alexander applied it globally. If Greeks were superior to barbarians, then surely Macedonians, led by him, were superior to everyone. Even science was co-opted. Aristotle's teachings on geography inspired Alexander to reach the edges of the known world, not because it was peaceful or wise to do so, but because there might be a river no Greek had ever seen, or a mountain no soldier had ever climbed. In one sense, he became a scientific explorer. In another, an obsessive collector of victories. Aristotle also stressed the unity of opposites, that understanding comes from grasping both sides of an argument. Alexander, however, often interpreted opposition as something to be defeated, not understood. His version of balance was to conquer both sides and then lecture them on harmony. Still, the influence ran deep. Alexander developed a lifelong interest in medicine, often treating wounded soldiers himself. He learned to question omens, to observe the natural world, and to debate ethics, even if he rarely let them slow him down. He carried Aristotle's lessons across deserts and over mountains. Even in Babylon, even after years of bloodshed, he could still quote Aristotle from memory. But as Alexander's power grew, so did the cracks in their relationship. The first real break came over foreigners, specifically Persians. Aristotle, like many Greeks, believed in clear boundaries, Greek and non-Greek, civilized and barbarian. Alexander, on the other hand, began to blur those lines. He married Persian nobility, dressed in Persian robes, encouraged his generals to intermarry and adopt local customs. He dreamed of a new blended empire, part Greek, part Persian, something beyond the narrow lens of Aristotle's logic. Aristotle was not amused. To the philosopher, culture was not just a tool. It was an identity, something to preserve, not dilute. His former pupil, now claiming to be a son of Zeus Ammon and demanding divine honors, had clearly gone off script. There's even a story that after Alexander executed Callisthenes, a historian and relative of Aristotle who had criticized Alexander's growing megalomania, Aristotle began to fear for his own life. The boy he once taught had become a king who no longer listened. And yet, Aristotle's fingerprints were everywhere. Alexander didn't just conquer. He cataloged. He brought botanists, geographers, engineers on campaign. He wrote letters asking for biological specimens from India, for reports on river systems, for notes on new animals and peoples. Wherever he went, he saw not just land, but knowledge. He was not merely a destroyer. He was a curious tyrant, a philosopher king with a sword in one hand and a scroll in the other. This contradiction, this tension between violence and vision, was pure Aristotle, even if the old man would have shaken his head at how far the boy took it. By the time Alexander marched into Egypt, Aristotle's teachings had morphed into a new theology. The student who once asked about ethics now declared himself a god on earth. He built temples to himself, demanded proskynesis, ritual kneeling. It was no longer about reason. It was about glory. But even then, in his final years, Alexander never fully discarded Aristotle. He wrote to him, spoke of his discoveries, reflected on the nature of fate, death, virtue. And when he died, young, feverish, paranoid, it was not in war but in contemplation, in a palace in Babylon, perhaps thinking of Achilles, perhaps thinking of his teacher. We don't know if Aristotle mourned him, but we do know this. The empire Alexander carved was not just with spears, but with ideas. His cities, though drenched in conquest, carried Greek language, law, literature, and above all, philosophy. In the end, Aristotle wanted to shape a wise man. He got a god instead, a restless, brilliant, dangerous god, educated, enlightened, and utterly unstoppable. Alexander's rise to the throne was sudden, sharp, and soaked in whispers. On the surface, it was the expected transfer of royal power, a son ascending after the assassination of his father. But under the surface, that's where the blood curdles and the speculation begins. The year was 336 BCE. King Philip II, ruler of Macedonia, veteran of dozens of campaigns, the man who had united Greece under Macedonian domination, walked confidently into the theater at Aegae. The occasion was grand, a public celebration of his daughter's marriage to the king of Epirus. Dignitaries from across the Greek world were in attendance. The stage was set for glory. And then he was murdered, struck down by Pausanias, one of his own bodyguards. Not during battle, not at the hands of a foreign agent. No, murdered in peacetime by someone inside the palace, during what should have been a ceremonial high point. Pausanias fled the scene briefly, but he didn't get far. Other guards caught and killed him almost immediately, which was, let's say, awfully convenient. Dead men don't explain their motives. Dead men don't name names. And so began one of the oldest murder mysteries in European history. The official story was neat. Pausanias had a personal grudge. Some say he had once been romantically involved with Philip and felt scorned. Others that he had been assaulted by another officer and felt Philip had failed to defend his honor. A tale of jealousy, humiliation, and revenge. But unofficially, well, the theories began to swirl before the body was even cold. One name came up quickly and often: Olympias, the queen, mother of Alexander. She had never been a quiet woman, and she had certainly never forgiven Philip for taking another wife. Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman whose very existence threatened Alexander's claim to the throne. Olympias, it is said, was furious. Her son, though older, was now at risk of being replaced in the line of succession by a new child, a full-blooded Macedonian heir, not one born of a foreign queen like herself. Was she involved in the assassination? We don't know. But what we do know is that shortly after Philip's death, Olympias had Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant daughter murdered, allegedly burned alive, or possibly forced to hang themselves. Just a little house cleaning. And what of Alexander himself? He was 20 years old, ambitious, brilliant, trained by Aristotle, a war hero already. He had everything except the crown. He was also conveniently not present at the scene of the crime. And the moment Philip died, Alexander moved. Fast. He secured the loyalty of the army. He rallied the nobles. He had the support of Antipater, one of Philip's most powerful generals. He was crowned king in a matter of days. It was efficient, surgical, almost rehearsed. So is Alexander involved in the plot to kill his father? Let's pause and be boringly historical for a moment. There is no concrete evidence, no ancient source, not Plutarch, not Diodorus, not Arrian, definitively claims that Alexander orchestrated the assassination. Most point toward Olympias as the more likely culprit. Alexander may have benefited, but benefiting is not the same as conspiring. Still, the optics aren't great. His father dies. His rival half-brother is sidelined. His stepmother and infant stepsister are eliminated. The palace is cleansed of political threats. And within a month, Alexander is riding high as king of Macedon, speaking of divine destiny and imperial dreams. It doesn't take a conspiracy theorist to raise an eyebrow. And it doesn't help that Alexander never seemed too interested in mourning. His grief was quiet. Publicly, he honored his father's legacy. He continued many of Philip's military plans. He claimed that he would finish what his father began. But privately, he distanced himself. Perhaps that was wise. Perhaps it was cold. After all, if you are to become a god, you cannot remain a son. The ancient sources, for all their drama, offer no smoking gun. Just shadows, silhouettes in torchlight. People who could have done it. People who benefited. People who remained quiet at suspicious moments. What we do know is this. The aftermath was ruthless. Once king, Alexander began eliminating potential threats, not openly, not with trials, but with quiet disappearances. Men who had once supported other factions began vanishing. Rivals fled. Dissidents died. His rise to power, while not necessarily bloody in public, was unforgiving in private. And perhaps this tells us more than the murder itself. Whether or not Alexander planned the assassination, he knew how to use it. He stepped into power without hesitation. He didn't spend years consolidating his rule. He became king with frightening ease. And that, more than anything, might explain why people have always suspected his hand in the crime. Because this was a young man who was not surprised by his own greatness. He expected it. He was ready for it. In the end, the question of Alexander's involvement in Philip's death may never be answered. It may not even matter. In the ancient world, legitimacy was often secured by results, not morality. Kings were not expected to be clean, only successful. And Alexander was very, very successful. So whether or not he plotted in the shadows, whether or not he whispered to his mother behind closed curtains, or whether fate simply cleared his path with divine timing, the outcome was the same. Philip was dead. Alexander was king. And the world, whether it knew it or not, had just become his. Chapter 2: Scandals and Rumors. Alexander's rise to the throne was sudden, sharp, and soaked in whispers. On the surface, it was the expected transfer of royal power, a son ascending after the assassination of his father. But under the surface, that's where the blood curdles and the speculation begins. The year was 336 BCE. King Philip II, ruler of Macedonia, veteran of dozens of campaigns, the man who had united Greece under Macedonian domination, walked confidently into the theater at Aegae. The occasion was grand, a public celebration of his daughter's marriage to the king of Epirus. Dignitaries from across the Greek world were in attendance. The stage was set for glory. And then, he was murdered, struck down by Pausanias, one of his own bodyguards. Not during battle, not at the hands of a foreign agent. No, murdered in peacetime by someone inside the palace, during what should have been a ceremonial high point. Pausanias fled the scene, briefly, but he didn't get far. Other guards caught and killed him almost immediately, which was, let's say, awfully convenient. Dead men don't explain their motives. Dead men don't name names. And so began one of the oldest murder mysteries in European history. The official story was neat. Pausanias had a personal grudge. Some say he had once been romantically involved with Philip and felt scorned. Others that he had been assaulted by another officer and felt Philip had failed to defend his honor. A tale of jealousy, humiliation, and revenge. But unofficially, well, the theories began to swirl before the body was even cold. One name came up quickly and often: Olympias, the queen, mother of Alexander. She had never been a quiet woman, and she had certainly never forgiven Philip for taking another wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman whose very existence threatened Alexander's claim to the throne. Olympias, it is said, was furious. Her son, though older, was now at risk of being replaced in the line of succession by a new child, a full-blooded Macedonian heir, not one born of a foreign queen like herself. Was she involved in the assassination? We don't know. But what we do know is that shortly after Philip's death, Olympias had Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant daughter murdered, allegedly burned alive, or possibly forced to hang themselves. Just a little house cleaning. And what of Alexander himself? He was 20 years old, ambitious, brilliant, trained by Aristotle, a war hero already. He had everything except the crown. He was also conveniently not present at the scene of the crime. And the moment Philip died, Alexander moved. Fast. He secured the loyalty of the army. He rallied the nobles. He had the support of Antipater, one of Philip's most powerful generals. He was crowned king in a matter of days. It was efficient, surgical, almost rehearsed. So is Alexander involved in the plot to kill his father? Let's pause and be boringly historical for a moment. There is no concrete evidence, no ancient source, not Plutarch, not Diodorus, not Arrian, definitively claims that Alexander orchestrated the assassination. Most point toward Olympias as the more likely culprit. Alexander may have benefited, but benefiting is not the same as conspiring. Still, the optics aren't great. His father dies. His rival half-brother is sidelined. His stepmother and infant stepsister are eliminated. The palace is cleansed of political threats. And within a month, Alexander is riding high as king of Macedon, speaking of divine destiny and imperial dreams. It doesn't take a conspiracy theorist to raise an eyebrow. And it doesn't help that Alexander never seemed too interested in mourning. His grief was quiet. Publicly, he honored his father's legacy. He continued many of Philip's military plans. He claimed that he would finish what his father began. But privately, he distanced himself. Perhaps that was wise. Perhaps it was cold. After all, if you are to become a god, you cannot remain a son. The ancient sources, for all their drama, offer no smoking gun. Just shadows, silhouettes in torchlight, people who could have done it, people who benefited, people who remained quiet at suspicious moments. What we do know is this: the aftermath was ruthless. Once king, Alexander began eliminating potential threats, not openly, not with trials, but with quiet disappearances. Men who had once supported other factions began vanishing. Rivals fled. Dissidents died. His rise to power, while not necessarily bloody in public, was unforgiving in private. And perhaps this tells us more than the murder itself. Whether or not Alexander planned the assassination, he knew how to use it. He stepped into power without hesitation. He didn't spend years consolidating his rule. He became king with frightening ease. And that, more than anything, might explain why people have always suspected his hand in the crime. Because this was a young man who was not surprised by his own greatness. He expected it. He was ready for it. In the end, the question of Alexander's involvement in Philip's death may never be answered. It may not even matter. In the ancient world, legitimacy was often secured by results, not morality. Kings were not expected to be clean, only successful. And Alexander was very, very successful. So whether or not he plotted in the shadows, whether or not he whispered to his mother behind closed curtains, or whether fate simply cleared his path with divine timing, the outcome was the same. Philip was dead. Alexander was king. And the world, whether it knew it or not, had just become his. There's an old Macedonian proverb, or at least there should be: you can conquer the world, but you can't conquer the wine. If ever a man needed this advice etched on a goblet, it was Alexander. To most of the ancient world, Alexander was a king, a god, a warrior, and a symbol of destiny fulfilled. But to those who served beside him day after day, particularly when the sun had set and the goblets began to clink, he was something else entirely: a drinker. And not a casual one. This was not the refined sipping of a civilized Athenian symposium. No liars, no debates over Plato. Alexander drank like a man possessed by ambition, by grief, by the ghost of Achilles, by some divine fury that couldn't sleep without drowning in fermented grape. Let's be clear, drinking in ancient Macedonian and Persian culture was common. Expected even. Feasts were diplomatic tools. Toast could seal alliances. Getting drunk was, at times, a performance of power. But Alexander drank beyond the pageantry. His court was infamous for its prolonged banquets. Some lasted days. And as the wine flowed, so did the unpredictability. Sometimes it ended in music and magnanimity. Other times it ended in murder. One of the most infamous episodes, and sadly, not the only one, came in 328 BCE in a drunken altercation that would haunt Alexander for the rest of his life. It happened in Marikanda, modern-day Samarkand, deep in Central Asia. There, in a banquet hall surrounded by Macedonian officers and Persian nobles, Alexander was already far into his cups when Clitus the Black, one of his oldest companions, made the fatal mistake of speaking his mind. Clitus wasn't just another officer. He was a man who had once saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus, slicing off the arm of a Persian noble who had nearly killed the young king. For that, he'd earned the king's gratitude and his proximity. He was one of the few who could speak frankly. Too frankly, as it turned out. The topic of the evening: how Persian Alexander had become. Clitus accused the king of forgetting his Macedonian roots, surrounding himself with foreigners, wearing Persian robes, demanding divine honors, and abandoning the customs of his homeland. It wasn't a new criticism, but it was loud, sharp, and delivered with wine on the breath. Alexander, also deep into drink, snapped. He shouted. Clitus shouted back. Insults flew. Rage rose. And then, before anyone could stop him, Alexander grabbed a spear and drove it straight through Clitus's chest. There was no ceremony, no trial, just blood. The room fell into stunned silence. The man who had once saved his life now lay dead by his hand. Killed not in war, not in politics, but in a drunken haze. What followed was complicated. Alexander was reportedly devastated. He locked himself in his chambers, refused food, refused sleep, cried, ranted, tried to kill himself. Some say he collapsed on Clitus's body, sobbing uncontrollably. Others claim he needed to be dragged away. He mourned, yes, but only after the damage was done. This episode would become a stain on his legacy. Not because it was unique, but because it was so public, so avoidable. Clitus wasn't a rebel. He was a loyal man. And Alexander, in that moment, had lost control, not of an army or a province, but of himself. And it wasn't the only time. The deeper Alexander marched into Asia, the more often his drunken fits turned dark. As the years wore on, his feasts began to resemble something between a ritual and a descent into madness. Proskynesis, the Persian act of bowing or kneeling, became a sticking point. Greek nobles refused to perform it, citing it as servile. Alexander demanded it. Tempers flared. More wine was poured. More men died. And the drinking didn't just destroy friendships. It reshaped his rule. Alcohol blurred lines between public and private, love and hate, loyalty and threat. Officers no longer knew when the king would embrace them or execute them. Words spoken over wine had the power to topple lives. One wrong toast, one poorly timed joke, and a man could vanish into the desert. Even Alexander's health began to show signs of wear. Though still young, he suffered from recurring fevers, violent mood swings, and episodes of near delirium. Was it battle fatigue? Poison? Or just years of heavy drinking catching up? Contemporary sources, none of which are exactly unbiased, seem to agree on one point: Alexander drank too much. Plutarch describes his violent temper when drunk. Curtius Rufus details the orgiastic banquets. Arrian, usually sympathetic, offers moments of hesitation, as if trying to find a balance between reverence and revulsion. Of course, this didn't stop Alexander from functioning. He remained a tactical genius, a logistical master, a visionary ruler. He could still lead armies, plan cities, and administer a vast empire. But when the sun went down and the wine came out, the God King became a man again, a broken, brilliant, brutal man. His drinking was not mere indulgence. It was coping. It was grief for Hephaestion, regret over Clitus, the crushing weight of prophecy, the existential dread of a man who had achieved too much, too soon, and still felt hollow. He had nothing left to conquer, so he drank, and it would follow him to the very end. In 323 BCE, not long before his death, Alexander attended yet another banquet, this one hosted by his admiral Nearchus. The drinking lasted into the early hours. Afterward, he went to another feast, hosted by Medius of Larissa. There, he reportedly drank a massive bowl of unmixed wine, an act both heroic and, frankly, stupid, and immediately collapsed with a violent fever. He never recovered. Some say it was malaria, or typhoid, or an old war wound flaring up. Others whisper of poison, but many point to the most boring and brutal answer: a body slowly destroyed by years of alcohol abuse and unchecked ambition. Alexander died as he lived, full of contradictions. A man of war and wisdom, a philosopher and a killer, a god and a boy, but also, heartbreakingly, a man who could conquer nations but not the wine in his cup. History remembers his battles. It sometimes forgets the banquets. There are moments in history so drenched in irony that even the gods, if they were watching, might have winced. One such moment happened in the ancient city of Marikanda, modern-day Samarkand, sometime in 328 BCE. The candles were lit, the wine was flowing, and Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, was deep into what we might now call his volatile drunk philosopher-king phase. The man sitting across from him was Clitus the Black, not a stranger, not a court sycophant, but a battle-hardened officer, Macedonian to the bone, and one of Alexander's most loyal companions. Clitus was no minor figure. He had once saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus, slicing down a Persian noble with a raised sword just as the young king was moments from death. For that act, he was celebrated, promoted, and, crucially, trusted. But this night, that bond would be broken. And it wouldn't be politics or treason that broke it. It would be ego, grief, national pride, and far too much wine. The argument began like many do when too much alcohol and too many old soldiers gather around a table. Words were exchanged. Jokes became insults. Pride was pricked. And then Clitus said the one thing Alexander didn't want to hear, that the king had abandoned his Macedonian roots. To be fair, this wasn't new criticism. Many of Alexander's officers had been grumbling. The king had begun wearing Persian robes, demanded proskynesis, the bowing ritual typical of Persian courts, and increasingly surrounded himself with Eastern advisors, adopting their customs, symbols, even their gods. Macedonians saw this as an affront, a betrayal of their rugged egalitarian traditions. But Clitus, emboldened by wine and maybe by years of friendship, said it aloud. And not gently. He reminded Alexander that his victories were made possible by his father Philip, by Macedonian discipline, not divine destiny. He mocked the idea of Alexander being a god king. He may have even accused him of going soft, that his achievements came on the backs of men who still fought like warriors while he sat on a golden throne. It was bold. It was unwise. Alexander, drunk and increasingly unhinged, snapped. He rose. He shouted. Those nearby tried to intervene, to pull Clitus away or calm the king. Some say Alexander called for a weapon, only to be denied. Others say someone handed him a spear, too late realizing what would come next. What followed was swift and irreversible. Alexander threw the spear, or perhaps lunged with it, and struck Clitus down. The man who had saved his life now died by his own hand. Not in war, not in betrayal, but over a cup of wine, in the heat of a drunken argument. The silence that followed was total. Then came the horror. Alexander, upon realizing what he had done, reportedly collapsed into a fit of grief. Some say he attempted to fall on his own sword. Others claim he wept over Clitus's body. He shut himself in his tent, refusing food, drink, even light for days. According to Plutarch, he cried out that he was no better than a murderer, that he had lost a piece of his soul. He begged his companions to kill him, since he no longer deserved the title of king. Of course, no one did. Kings don't get punished. Not really, but something shifted. This was not the calculated ruthlessness of a man eliminating a political rival. This was a spontaneous, emotional act of violence, and it showed a side of Alexander that terrified his inner circle. For the rest of his life, this moment would haunt him, not because it was his only crime, far from it, but because it was so personal. Clitus was not a threat. He was a friend. His death wasn't necessary. It was tragic, and it was human. And that perhaps is what makes it so enduring, because Alexander the Great is often portrayed as something more than human, the boy king, the invincible general, the divine monarch. But in this moment, he was simply a man who lost control, let his pride dictate his hand, and killed someone he loved. This single act captures the contradictions at the heart of his character. He could be brilliant and brutal, merciful and monstrous, a visionary and a tyrant. Clytus's death was a warning to those around him, and perhaps to himself. From that night forward, many of Alexander's men grew quieter. Fewer questioned him directly. The court grew tenser. The wine flowed as always, but now every toast came with caution. Alexander had crossed a line. Not politically, he'd done that plenty, but morally, even psychologically. He was no longer the favored son of Zeus, the invincible hero. He was a man who had tasted regret, and it did not sit well. And yet, life went on. Battles resumed. Cities were named. Statues erected. The machine of conquest never paused. Alexander never faced consequences, not formally. But the grief lingered, not on the battlefield, but in the corners of his eyes, in the hesitations at future banquets, in the ever-shorter list of people he truly trusted. By the end of his life, he had few close friends left. Hephaestion, of course, remained until his own tragic death. But Clytus? Clytus was a scar that never healed. A reminder that even gods, when drunk and wounded, can become deeply human. And that power, even absolute power, offers no protection from shame. So when we look at Alexander's legacy, his empires, his battles, his burning ambition, we must also look at that quiet moment in the candlelit halls of Maracanda. The night when glory gave way to guilt, when a king killed a friend, and when the greatest man in the world realized, if only for a moment, that he couldn't conquer himself. Chapter 3: Tyranny and Controversial Private Life. History loves a transformation story, and Alexander, always the overachiever, didn't just transform empires, he transformed himself. When he began, Alexander was a Macedonian prince raised on Homer, trained in phalanx warfare, and steeped in the rugged, no-frills politics of the Greek world. His authority came not from a throne handed down by gods, but from charisma, brute force, and a really sharp sword. He dined with his men. He bled beside them. They called him Alex, not divine son of Zeus Ammon. But somewhere between Anatolia and the Indus, the boy king began to change. Maybe it was the desert heat. Maybe it was the endless processions of kneeling nobles. Or maybe, and this seems likely, it was the slow realization that being a man wasn't enough anymore. And so Alexander, conqueror of Persia, began to become Persia. He adopted Persian dress, flowing robes, ornate jewelry, a golden diadem, gone were the short tunics of Macedon, replaced with garments that shimmered in the candlelight. He began to wear eyeliner. He walked less like a soldier and more like a god. He no longer just ruled, he performed rule. Then came the ceremonies. At court, Alexander began practicing proskynesis, the Persian ritual of prostration, where subjects bowed or even knelt before the king. It was, to Persians, a symbol of respect. To Macedonians, it was groveling. No free man should bow to another, especially not to a king who used to drink and joke beside them in battle camps. The court grew theatrical. The once blunt language of Macedon was replaced by flowery Persian flattery. Dignitaries addressed Alexander as Lord of Asia and son of his son. It was no longer enough to obey him. Now, one had to worship him, or at least pretend to. Unsurprisingly, this did not go over well with his generals. Men like Parmenion, Antipater, and even the sharp-tongued Craterus had served under Philip II. They came from a world where a king led from the front, not from a golden dais surrounded by eunuchs and incense. To them, Alexander's new attitude felt foreign, soft, even dangerous. Many saw it as a betrayal of the Greek ideal, where power was negotiated, not exalted. A good king, in their view, commanded respect, not demanded divinity. But Alexander wasn't trying to be a good king in the Greek sense. He was crafting something bigger, an identity that could rule all people, not just Macedonians. Persia had centuries of centralized monarchy, complete with divine imagery and ritual. Egypt had pharaohs descended from gods. India had divine warriors and cosmic kings. And Alexander, ever the strategist, understood that to keep an empire this vast, you needed more than military force. You needed myth. And so he built one, slowly and with theatrical precision. He let it spread that he was the son of Zeus Ammon after visiting the oracle in the Siwa oasis. He leaned into the symbolism. Coins showed him with horns of divinity. He stopped correcting people who called him divine. Sometimes he even encouraged it. He became less approachable, more remote. He listened to flatterers more than old comrades. He began to look less like Achilles and more like Darius III, the king he had defeated. This shift terrified his Macedonian companions, because in their eyes, he wasn't ascending. He was drifting away from his roots, away from their shared battles, away from them. What had once been camaraderie now became courtiership. The laughter around the campfires faded, and in its place came whispers, stiff greetings, and the sense that the man they'd followed across the earth was turning into something unrecognizable. Some tried to speak up. Callisthenes, a court historian and relative of Aristotle, famously refused to perform proskynesis, arguing that such acts were for gods, not men. He was later accused of conspiracy and died under suspicious circumstances. Others, like Clytus the Black, spoke more bluntly and paid dearly for it. The effect was chilling. As Alexander's image grew more sacred, his tolerance for dissent shrank, and the distance between him and his oldest allies widened. It's easy to say he was drunk on power, but perhaps it's more accurate to say he was desperate for stability. He knew empires did not survive on sword alone. He needed to be more than mortal to the Persians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and perhaps even to himself. He became his own myth, and that myth needed divine robes, not armor. Whether this was genius or delusion depends on how you look at it. From one angle, Alexander was trying to unite a fractured world. He believed, or claimed to believe, in homonoia, unity among peoples. He wanted Persians and Macedonians to marry, to serve together, to build something new. His own image as a god-king was part of that grand vision. But from another angle, he was losing himself piece by piece. The Macedonian boy who charged into Thebes with fire in his eyes had become a veiled figure, silent behind curtains of incense, demanding bowing and praise. His friends became afraid to speak. His soldiers obeyed, but murmured behind his back. The great conqueror was now a solitary figure, not because he had to be, but because he had made himself so. And in the end, even his divine image couldn't save him. He died not in a blaze of glory, but sick, surrounded by confused advisors, with no clear heir and no unity left. His divine robes could not hold the empire together, but they did something else. They left a legend. Alexander the Great, warrior, philosopher, emperor, and yes, self-declared son of Zeus, had become exactly what he set out to be. Not just a man who ruled the world, but a man the world would never quite understand. Trust for kings is a fragile thing. And for a king who calls himself divine, who spans continents and commands hundreds of thousands, it becomes more fragile still, brittle like polished marble, ready to crack at the faintest echo of disloyalty. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great was no longer merely conquering lands. He was also conquering shadows, the kind that moved behind his throne, whispered behind curtains, and wore familiar faces. One of those faces belonged to Philotas, son of Parmenion, one of the most experienced and respected generals in the Macedonian army. Parmenion had fought alongside Alexander's father, Philip II. He had led troops at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela. He was no firebrand, no glory seeker, just steady hands, cold eyes, and a lifetime of loyalty. Philotas, meanwhile, was different. Educated, polished, perhaps too refined for Macedonian tastes. He was known to be proud, perhaps too proud. He spoke with confidence, sometimes dangerously so. His relationship with Alexander had begun to fray. Too much sarcasm, too little deference. And in a world where a wrong word at dinner could become a death sentence, Philotas seemed unaware of how thin the ice beneath him had become. Then came the fatal mistake. A conspiracy was uncovered, a plot against Alexander's life. A minor nobleman named Dimnus was involved. According to reports, Philotas had learned of the plot, but failed to report it. Why? No one knows. Perhaps he dismissed it. Perhaps he hesitated. Perhaps, and this was the damning suggestion, he agreed with it. That was all Alexander needed. Philotas was arrested, interrogated, and eventually tortured. Even by ancient standards, the questioning was brutal. And after days of agony, he confessed. Though what he confessed to remains murky. Was it cowardice? Treason? Ambition? Or simply not bowing low enough? Not quickly enough? Either way, it didn't matter. Alexander ordered Philotas to be executed, a formal trial by the army, ending in a hail of stones and spears from the very soldiers he once commanded. But the story didn't end there. Because Parmenion, Philotas's father, was still alive. He was stationed far away, in Ecbatana, with control over vast amounts of supplies and troops. He had no knowledge of his son's arrest, no defense, no chance to object, and that, in itself, was a problem. Alexander, perhaps fearing revenge, perhaps convinced that loyalty, once questioned, can never be restored, sent a secret order. Parmenion, loyal servant of two kings, was assassinated without trial. No explanation, no conversation, just the sudden arrival of messengers, a brief moment of silence, and then death. Two men, a father and son, wiped from a map of power within days of each other. The shock rippled through the army. If Parmenion, the old lion, the faithful hand, could be cast aside so coldly, then no one was safe. Not Craterus, not Perdiccas, not even Hephaestion. The message was clear. Loyalty was not a shield. The king was watching, and his mercy had limits. And yet, there was no rebellion. The machine of conquest rolled on. Cities fell. More monuments were carved. But under the polished veneer, something had shifted. The inner circle that had once shared bread, scars, and songs now sat further apart, spoke more carefully, and wondered, silently, who might be next. To modern eyes, this all seems ruthless. But Alexander wasn't playing by modern rules. In his mind, perhaps, it wasn't betrayal he feared. It was fracture. His empire, stitched together with force and spectacle, could not afford doubt. One crack in the stone, and the whole facade might crumble. And so he chose security over sentiment. History, of course, has judged him harshly for it. Parmenion had given decades of service. Philotas, though proud, had not taken up arms. Their deaths stained Alexander's image with blood, not shed in battle, but in paranoia. Yet one must wonder, did he feel remorse? There are no records of lamentation, no weeping, no withdrawal into darkness like after the death of Clitus. Perhaps Alexander had grown colder, or perhaps he had simply learned that regret was a luxury, and gods, even pretend ones, do not weep twice. What we do know is that this was a turning point, not of conquest, but of isolation. From here on, Alexander ruled with more distance. His circle narrowed, his suspicions sharpened. The line between friend and threat became impossibly thin. And the boy who had once wept for Patroclus now ordered executions in silence. Perhaps this was the price of becoming a legend. But legend or not, one truth remains. No matter how many cities you name after yourself, no matter how far your empire stretches, you're only ever one bad rumor away from turning your sword on your own. By the time Alexander reached the heights of the Persian Empire, his victories had become routine, his army unstoppable, and his grip on power ironclad. But power, especially when stretched over two continents, has a price. It needs feeding, and nothing feeds power more regularly than fear. In 330 BCE, that fear took shape in the form of a conspiracy, or rather, a suspected one. The story began with a relatively minor nobleman named Dimnus, who was rumored to be plotting against Alexander's life. The details were vague, the evidence thin, but someone whispered something. Someone didn't report it soon enough. And that someone was Philotas. Philotas was no minor player. He was the son of Parmenion, one of Alexander's most trusted and senior generals, a man who had served under Philip II before him, and helped guide Alexander's earliest campaigns. Parmenion was the rock beneath the whirlwind, the seasoned elder among brilliant but younger officers. His son, however, was less grounded. Philotas was clever, sophisticated, too eloquent perhaps. He dressed well, spoke with a polished tongue, and carried himself with the air of a man who believed he might someday rule something himself. This didn't go unnoticed, and in a court that had begun to murmur with godhood and divine right, there was little room for ambiguous ambition. So when the alleged conspiracy came to light, when it was revealed that Philotas had learned about it but failed to inform the king, the hammer dropped swiftly. Alexander summoned a trial, but not the kind you might imagine. This was a public affair, led by the army itself. Officers who had once eaten beside Philotas now stood in judgment. Under torture, a favorite ancient tool for clarity, Philotas eventually confessed to what exactly is debatable. Perhaps he had been careless. Perhaps he had been critical of Alexander in private. Perhaps he had simply looked too confident. It was enough. The army sentenced him to death. A nobleman, son of a general, dragged out and stoned or speared by his own peers. But that was only the beginning, because Parmenion, father of the condemned, still lived. He was far away in Ecbatana, managing one of the empire's largest military garrisons. He had not been part of the trial. He had not been consulted. He had not even been informed that his son was arrested. That, in Alexander's eyes, made him a liability. If he heard of his son's death too soon, he might rebel. If he didn't, he might be plotting already. And so, without trial, without warning, Alexander dispatched assassins to eliminate Parmenion. 2. The man who had served the Macedonian crown longer than Alexander had been alive. The man who had secured the empire's rear while the king marched forward into glory. The man who had done everything right, except be the father of the wrong man. One letter, one dagger, one final breath in the cold highlands of Persia. The effect on the court was immediate. It was no longer just dangerous to be a traitor. It was dangerous to be close to one, or even suspected of proximity. Commanders who had once spoken freely now measured their words. The wine at the royal table soured. What had once been a circle of comrades hardened into something colder. A hierarchy maintained by suspicion rather than loyalty. The older generation, in particular, felt the shift. Men like Parmenion had grown up in a world of Macedonian directness, a kingdom where kings were men, not gods, and disputes were settled with arguments or swords, not staged trials and secret executions. Alexander's new world, full of robes, rituals, and whispered denunciations, was foreign to them, dangerous, and yet the army kept marching. They crossed more rivers, took more cities, killed more kings. But the trust that had once bound the Macedonian elite was cracking. Not loudly, just enough to feel it in the silence. In a way eyes no longer met. In a way generals lingered a little longer in their tents before coming to council. They had seen what happened to those who stood too close to the fire. Some historians have argued that Alexander had no choice. That leaving Parmenion alive after Philotas' execution would have been reckless. That he had to protect himself and the unity of the army. And maybe they're right. But even if the move was necessary, it was also chilling. Parmenion had committed no known crime. He had not spoken against the king. He had not betrayed the army. He had simply been in the wrong place. The father of a son who asked too few questions and answered too late. There were no public regrets, no grand funeral, no poetry composed in his honor. He was gone, forgotten by decree. And so Alexander's court grew quieter, more loyal, perhaps, or at least more cautious. The dissent faded. The risks were too high. It was in many ways the beginning of Alexander's second reign, the era not of conquest, but of control. Not just of land, but of language, of silence, of thought. After all, what is a king without fear? Just another man with a crown. But one who commands silence, that's a god. Or at least, a man who wishes very badly to be remembered as one. If Alexander conquered the known world with a sword in one hand, he held something much softer in the other, the hand of Hephaestion. Among all the names that orbit the life of Alexander, generals, kings, philosophers, None sits quite as close or quite as intimately as that of Hephaestion Amyntoros. Tall, handsome, a fellow Macedonian noble, and, according to some ancient authors, virtually indistinguishable from the king himself in dress and demeanor, Hephaestion wasn't just a friend. He was the constant, the shadow, the person at Alexander's side when the dust of conquest settled and the torches burned low. And for centuries, this closeness has sparked questions, whispers, speculations wrapped in footnotes. Were they lovers? The answer, perhaps frustratingly, is both yes and no, depending on where you're sitting in history. Let's begin with what we know. Hephaestion and Alexander were childhood friends, possibly educated together under Aristotle. Hephaestion served as a key general and diplomat throughout Alexander's campaigns. He was entrusted with commanding troops, negotiating marriages, delivering proclamations. And more than once, Alexander publicly equated Hephaestion with Patroclus, the beloved companion of Achilles, a pairing famously laced with homoerotic overtones in Homeric tradition. That comparison was no accident. To call someone your Patroclus wasn't just poetic, it was pointed. In a world where myth and politics blurred, invoking that relationship carried weight. It was a declaration of loyalty, affection, and for those inclined to interpret it as such, romantic devotion. Of course, the ancient sources, as always, complicate matters. Roman authors like Curtius Rufus and later biographers, such as Plutarch, do not give us graphic detail. They do not confirm a sexual relationship, but they also don't deny it. Instead, they offer phrases like more than friendship or closer than brothers, which in modern biography tend to raise eyebrows. But here's the thing. Ancient Greek society didn't care. Not in the way we think. In Macedon and much of the classical Greek world, romantic and even sexual relationships between men were not necessarily condemned. They were, in fact, often idealized, especially when tied to mentorship, military camaraderie, or intellectual exchange. Masculinity was not defined by whom one loved, but by how one lived, bravely, publicly, and with honor. And Alexander certainly lived loudly. So why does the question of Hephaestion's role continue to fascinate? Because it cuts through the bronze busts and battlefield dust and reminds us that behind the conqueror was a person, someone who longed, trusted, and grieved. And no moment illustrates that grief more than Hephaestion's death. In 324 BCE, in the city of Ecbatana, Hephaestion fell ill, possibly from typhoid fever or another infection common among armies on the move. Despite Alexander's personal involvement in his treatment, Hephaestion died. Alexander's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He ordered a national mourning period. He refused to eat. He shaved his head, a striking gesture of grief. He crucified the doctor accused of negligence. He demanded a funeral on the scale of royalty, commissioning a massive pyre and statues across the empire. Some ancient writers claim he even petitioned the oracle at Siwa to declare Hephaestion a god. A friend's death? Or the collapse of a world held together by love? For Alexander, who had marched across continents, bent nations to his will, and faced down Persian kings, Hephaestion's death was the only enemy he could not defeat. And this grief, more than anything else, confirms the depth of their bond. Of course, later empires, particularly the Romans and Christians, had a harder time with this narrative. The idea of a world-conquering king who may have loved another man didn't fit neatly into their visions of virtue or masculinity. So the language was softened, sanitized, lost between translations and centuries. But the traces remain. Coins bearing twin images. Temples built in memory. The echoes of Patroclus and Achilles in official speeches. The kind of myth-making that Alexander himself, always aware of performance and legacy, knew would be examined, twisted, and retold. And perhaps that was the point. By not defining the relationship, Alexander left it open to myth, open to projection. Was Hephaestion his advisor, his general, his brother-in-arms? Certainly, but perhaps also his heart. That ambiguity was strategic, because love, in all its forms, adds dimension to a legend. It softens the bronze, makes the sword-wielding God King just a little more human. And in the quiet moments between battles, that humanity might have been what Alexander needed most. So were they lovers? Maybe, maybe not. But they were undeniably devoted. In an age where kings demanded loyalty but rarely gave it in return, Alexander gave something to Hephaestion that he gave to no other man. His tears, his trust, and the kind of mourning that cracks statues. And for a man who conquered the world, that vulnerability might be the most powerful thing he ever left behind. Chapter 4. The Mysterious Death. The end of the world came quietly. Not with a sword, not with a storm, but with a fever, a whisper beneath the skin, a burning behind the eyes. The man who had crossed mountains, broken empires, and crowned himself king of Asia was now lying still, unmoving, sweating, and silent, in a palace in Babylon. It was June of 323 BCE. Alexander was 32 years old. He had conquered more than any mortal before him. His empire stretched from the sunlit shores of Greece to the banks of the Indus River, stitched together by armies, cities, and dreams. But now none of that mattered, because the one thing he could not conquer was inside him. It began, we're told, after a banquet. There was drinking, of course. There was always drinking. Alexander was famous for it, for toasting too long, for drinking too much, for making politics out of wine. That night, he reportedly celebrated the completion of yet another campaign, this time against the Caucasians, a local mountain tribe. The details blur. Some say he collapsed immediately. Others say it took days. But what we do know is that a fever began. It rose slowly, but relentlessly. For over a week, his condition worsened. He lost the ability to speak. His general stood by, helpless. His body remained warm, but his eyes faded. The palace, once filled with movement and command, fell into hushed chaos. Every major general came. They stood by the door, too afraid to enter. They begged for a sign, for a word, for a gesture, but Alexander gave them none. According to some accounts, he raised his hand, just once, in acknowledgement. Others say he lay there, unmoving, while his empire trembled around him. He never recovered, and sometime around the 10th or 11th day, he died. No fanfare, no grand last words, just the heat and the silence and the slow dimming of a life that had burned far too bright. What killed him? That is the question. Ancient sources give no clear answer. Some say it was malaria, common in the marshy lowlands of Mesopotamia. Others suggest typhoid fever, brought on by the unsanitary conditions of military life. A few whispered darker things. Poison, slipped into his wine by a rival, a lover, or an ambitious general. But poison seems unlikely. Most toxins act quickly. Alexander's illness lasted nearly 2 weeks. Long enough for doubt to creep in, but not fast enough to fit the stories of a dramatic assassination. Unless, of course, it was a rare and subtle poison, the kind that only legends remember. There are modern theories, too. Some doctors have retroactively diagnosed pancreatitis, or Guillain-Barré syndrome, or West Nile virus. Some believe his body may have shut down slowly, even as his mind remained painfully alert, a prisoner inside his own skull. And then there's the strangest detail of all. After his death, they say his body didn't decay. Not for days. Not a blemish. Not a smell. Not a sign of death. His soldiers believed it was a miracle, a sign that he truly was divine. The son of Zeus Ammon made flesh. Others, more modern, suggest a chilling possibility that Alexander was not dead at all, that he had slipped into a coma, that he was paralyzed but alive, that he was buried or embalmed while still breathing. We will never know, because history doesn't always give us clean endings. Sometimes, even the greatest stories fade rather than finish. And so, Alexander died, alone, in a room filled with worried generals and muted footsteps. The man who had been called a god, a hero, a butcher, a liberator, now reduced to skin, fever, and breathless stillness. No army could stop it. No oracle had warned him. No glory could preserve him. Just 32 years, and then nothing. But even in death, Alexander would not be still. His body, embalmed in honey or wine, or both, will be fought over, stolen, paraded, and buried more than once. His tomb would become a site of pilgrimage, his memory a battleground. Because when someone dies with the world still in their hands, the world does not simply let go. It begins to argue over what exactly has been lost. When a man who has never been defeated in battle dies quietly in his bed, questions are inevitable. Alexander's death, shrouded in fever and mystery, has become one of antiquity's great unsolved riddles. For all the chroniclers, all the statues, all the pages dedicated to his victories, we're left with remarkably little certainty about how he actually died. What we do have are theories, ancient and modern, drawn from vague symptoms, confused timelines, and a slow-burning fever that silenced the most ambitious conqueror the world had ever seen. The first and most frequently cited cause is malaria. This makes sense, at least geographically. Babylon, where Alexander died, sat in the marshy lands of Mesopotamia, filled with mosquitoes and stagnant water. Malaria was common, particularly in the early summer when he fell ill. The progression fits: fever, weakness, delirium. A slow decline over 10 or 11 days. And yet, malaria doesn't explain everything. The duration, the intensity, the collapse of multiple organs? Perhaps, but perhaps not. Others have pointed to typhoid fever, which would also have been widespread in a region with poor sanitation, especially among soldiers. Typhoid can cause prolonged fever, abdominal pain, and mental confusion, symptoms consistent with the ancient accounts. There are even references to Alexander experiencing intense stomach pain and possible paralysis near the end of his life. If true, that would make typhoid a strong candidate. And yet the accounts vary. Some describe him falling ill immediately after a drinking contest. Others suggest the illness came on more gradually. One source mentions a sudden pain in the back after taking a drink, which has led modern historians and physicians to consider other possibilities. One of them is acute pancreatitis, possibly brought on by heavy alcohol use. Alexander was known for his excessive drinking. Tales of all-night banquets and wine-fueled rages weren't just gossip. They were part of his legend. Pancreatitis, often triggered by chronic alcohol abuse, can cause intense abdominal pain, fever, nausea, and systemic collapse. It can also be drawn out over days, as was the case with Alexander. Other modern scholars have proposed Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that leads to progressive paralysis while leaving the patient mentally aware. This theory is often cited to explain the eerily preserved state of Alexander's body after death. According to some ancient accounts, his corpse showed no sign of decomposition for days, a miracle that some took as proof of his divine nature. But it could also indicate that he wasn't dead at all, at least not right away. The Guillain-Barré hypothesis is chilling. It suggests Alexander may have been in a deep coma, paralyzed but conscious, declared dead before his body actually gave out. If true, he would have experienced his own death in slow motion, aware, silent, and helpless. It's a disturbing idea, but one rooted in clinical possibility. There's also the darker suggestion of poison. The idea that Alexander was murdered has never fully disappeared. A plot by disloyal generals, angry Persians, or even his own inner circle. It's the kind of narrative that fits neatly into the political instability of the time. But most poisons act quickly, and Alexander's decline was slow. Unless it was a very rare and subtle toxin, the theory struggles to match the timeline. Moreover, no ancient source offers hard evidence of poisoning. Even the rumors that did exist were vague, more the product of distrust and grief than medical observation. In the absence of a credible assassin, poison remains a romantic, if unlikely, explanation. Ultimately, we are left with a puzzle made of fragments. The fever was real. The collapse was certain. The body, it seems, stayed strangely intact for days. But the precise cause? Still a mystery. It is ironic in a way. Alexander, the man who left nothing unexplored, nothing unconquered, could not conquer his own mortality. And while modern historians can reconstruct battle formations and troop movements with astonishing precision, his death, that quiet, human ending, remains beyond our reach. Perhaps it's fitting. Perhaps some legends aren't meant to be solved, because while his empire crumbled after his passing, the mystery of his death has endured. It's a story retold by physicians, poets, and skeptics alike, each offering their own diagnosis, their own theory, their own shade of finality. And yet Alexander remains not on the battlefield, but in the questions that outlived him. Questions without answers. No great man dies without rumors. And Alexander, whose life was written in gold and blood, whose empire stretched from Europe to India, was no exception. In the smoky halls of Babylon, as word of his death spread like wildfire, one whisper caught flame faster than any other. He was poisoned. It's not a surprising thought. After all, Alexander had enemies. Many of them. Ambitious generals, bitter rivals, old allies grown suspicious of his eastern ways. In his final years, he had begun to adopt the customs of Persian kings, demanding prostration, wearing foreign dress, even referring to himself as divine. For his Macedonian officers, raised on the values of rough equality and battlefield camaraderie, this shift was unsettling, dangerous, even. Add to that his execution of trusted men like Parmenion and Philotas, the sudden death of Hephaestion, the endless campaigns, the fatigue of war, the uncertainty of succession. Alexander had no clear heir, no son of age, no will, save for the cryptic answer he allegedly gave on his deathbed when asked who should rule after him: to the strongest. In that vacuum, ambition was a poison far more powerful than anything in a cup. So the story goes, someone, perhaps Antipater, the regent of Macedon, or one of his sons, slipped poison into Alexander's wine at a banquet. The effects were slow, almost unnoticeable at first, but by morning, the conqueror was sweating, then stumbling, then silent. A neat story. Tidy, clean, dramatic, but not very convincing. There are a few problems with the poisoning theory, and the first is historical silence. The earliest sources we have, including the royal diaries and the accounts of his generals, make no mention of poison. The idea doesn't appear until much later, sometimes a century or more after Alexander's death, when Roman authors like Justin and Plutarch began to retell the events with a bit more flair and a bit less skepticism. Even then, the details are inconsistent. Some claim the poison came from India, so deadly that it needed to be stored in the hoof of a horse. Others say it was delivered by a relative of Aristotle. One version even involves wine that had been cursed. These aren't investigations. They're campfire stories. Modern historians are, for the most part, unconvinced. The biggest issue is the timeline. Alexander didn't die quickly. His illness dragged on for 10 or 11 days. A full week and a half of rising fever, fading strength, and a slow, progressive collapse. Most poisons, especially in antiquity, worked much faster. The few that didn't, such as arsenic or heavy metals, would have required prolonged exposure and likely would have produced different symptoms. And then there's the question of motive. Yes, many in Alexander's circle had reason to fear him. He had grown increasingly autocratic, increasingly unpredictable. But poisoning the king of the world is no small matter, especially one surrounded by a loyal bodyguard, feared by every general in his empire, and capable of swift, brutal revenge. If someone had poisoned Alexander, they would have needed not just access, but absolute confidence that the deed would go undiscovered. And yet, not one of the supposed conspirators rose to power immediately after his death. There was no sudden transfer of glory, just chaos, a power vacuum, civil war, which leads us to a more likely explanation. Alexander died of natural causes: fever, infection, or possibly internal illness. His decline was messy, slow, and very human. But to the men around him, men used to seeing him as invincible, that very humanity was difficult to accept. Poison gave them a reason. A plot gave them closure. It made more sense than admitting that even a god king could be brought down by something as mundane as a virus. Still, the rumor persists. Even today, the image of Alexander, goblet in hand, betrayed by someone close to him, holds a certain allure. It's the drama of Caesar's Ides of March, centuries before Caesar was even born. The idea that someone so powerful could be undone not by an enemy army, but by a single drop. But sometimes history doesn't offer grand conclusions. Just silence, just breath, just a body, slowly cooling in the heat of Babylon. Was he poisoned? Almost certainly not. But then again, Alexander's greatest enemy was never a rival general, never a Persian king, never even the vast terrain he crossed. It was his own myth, one so powerful that, even in death, it refused to accept the ordinary. And so the legend of poison lives on, not because it is likely, but because it is fitting. Because it feels like the ending a story this big should have, even if it isn't true. Part 3. The Immortal Legacy. Chapter 1. Political and Geographical Legacy. Alexander never built walls. He broke them. He was not born into the world's greatest empire. He created it. Piece by piece, city by city, through grit, brilliance, and blood. By the time he died in 323 BCE, his conquests had reshaped the known world. From the golden fields of Macedon to the monsoon-soaked rivers of India, from the sun-bleached sands of Egypt to the high plains of Bactria, Alexander's domain was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. It spanned over 5,000 kilometers east to west, touching 3 continents. There was no Rome yet, no empire in China that reached that far. Persia had once claimed greatness, but Alexander's reach eclipsed even the mighty Achaemenid dynasty he had overthrown. And what's more impressive, he did it all in just 11 years. No emperor before him had moved so far, so fast. But conquest is one thing. Control is another. Despite the sheer scale of it, Alexander's empire was stitched together not by bureaucracy or roads, but by his presence, by the awe of him. The mere idea of Alexander, son of Zeus, hero of Achilles' bloodline, became a kind of invisible force that held it all in place. Cities bowed to him. Soldiers followed him into deserts with no water. Enemies, Persian kings, Indian rajas, mountain chieftains, all fell before him, some defeated in battle, others simply overwhelmed by reputation alone. But no system of governance can survive forever on awe. When Alexander died at the age of 32, the empire he had carved with such urgency faced a simple question. Now what? There was no plan. No successor strong enough to hold it all together. His infant son, Alexander IV, was too young. His generals, the so-called Diadochi, or successors, were too ambitious. And so the empire broke, but the shape of it remained. Even as his generals carved up the territory, Egypt to Ptolemy, Asia to Seleucus, Macedon to Antipater, the map still bore Alexander's fingerprints. New kingdoms rose where he had walked. The Seleucid Empire in the east, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Cities founded in his name. More than 20 Alexandrias became administrative hubs, trade ports, or bastions of Greek culture in foreign lands. Perhaps most famously, Alexandria in Egypt would become a center of learning, science, and philosophy for centuries to come, a kind of lighthouse of civilization. Inspired by a man who had once knelt before an oracle in the Siwa oasis and been told he was divine. The political fragmentation that followed his death did not erase what he had built. Instead, it created a network of successor states that, while often at war with each other, still carried on his vision. Not of one ruler over all things, but of a world interconnected by culture, language, and ambition. Ironically, the unity he fought so hard to create never truly existed. But the impact of trying? That would last much longer. The sheer idea of an empire stretching from Greece to India, held together by one man, would haunt history. Caesar would look to it. Napoleon would fantasize about it. Even modern empires, centuries later, would whisper Alexander's name like a spell of possibility. Because more than anything, Alexander's political legacy was imagination. He proved it could be done. And for empires, that's sometimes all it takes. In the quiet deserts where he once rode, in the mountains where his horses once climbed, echoes of that ambition still remain. A trade route here, a city there, a ruin with an inscription in Greek, surrounded by a language it was never meant to touch. Alexander's empire may have died with him, but its ghost, that idea of conquest without borders, of cultures colliding, of the world united under a single will, never truly left. It's still out there, just like he wanted. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, there was no plan, no named heir, no smooth transition of power, just silence. He left behind an empire too large, too diverse, and too newly conquered to be held together by memory alone. And so, like the great hero Achilles, whom Alexander idolized, his legacy was devoured not by enemies, but by those closest to him. The Diadochi, or successors, were his generals, companions, and governors, men who had followed him across deserts and mountains, through the blood and dust of Persia and beyond. They had shared his victories. They had toasted to his health. But with the king gone, loyalty turned to ambition. The fragile threads of unity began to unravel. At first, they pretended to hold the empire together. A regency was declared on behalf of Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, and his unborn son, Alexander IV. But everyone knew the truth. These figureheads were placeholders, and behind the curtains, the knives were already being drawn. The Wars of the Diadochi, a long and tangled series of civil conflicts, which stretch on for decades. Generals who had once fought side by side now raised armies against each other, carving up the empire like wolves around a carcass. By the time the dust settled, what had once been Alexander's singular domain had split into several independent kingdoms. Ptolemy I Soter took Egypt, founding a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years, ending with Cleopatra. Seleucus I Nicator established the Seleucid Empire, ruling much of the former Persian territory from Asia Minor to India. Cassander, son of Antipater, took Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus controlled Thrace and parts of western Anatolia. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, attempted to hold the empire together but was ultimately defeated. The unity Alexander had dreamed of dissolved. But something strange happened. Even though the empire was gone, his influence remained. These new kingdoms still bore the imprint of their creator. They were ruled by Macedonian elites, spoke Greek in their courts, and continued to build cities in the Hellenic style. Coins bore his face. Statues imitated his posture. Even long after his body had been laid to rest, or stolen, embalmed, and put on display, depending on which legend you prefer, Alexander's image haunted the lands he once ruled. In Egypt, the Ptolemies presented themselves not just as pharaohs, but as heirs to Alexander's divine mission. In the East, Seleucid kings used Greek as the language of administration while ruling over a Persian and Mesopotamian majority. Even in India, echoes of Alexander's invasion would ripple for generations, influencing local rulers and trade. The idea of Hellenistic kingship, a hybrid of Greek ambition and Eastern ceremony, was born in this fractured world. The Diadochi may have fought each other with brutal resolve, but they all carried forward the essential contradiction of Alexander's rule, the fusion of conquest and culture, of military strength and divine image. And despite the endless bloodshed, this strange experiment worked, at least for a while. Trade flourished, cities grew, ideas crossed borders, and everywhere, the ghost of Alexander lingered, not as a man anymore, but as a symbol. The political borders he created did not last, but the mental map he left behind shaped the world long after the Diadochi were dead. Rome would later move into the lands once held by the Seleucids. Egypt would fall to Caesar, then to Augustus. But each of these empires inherited not just territory, but a vision, one born in the whirlwind left by a king who had died too soon. So yes, the empire fractured, the dream splintered, but what remains remarkable is not that it fell apart. All empires do, but that its pieces still shimmered with the light of the man who built it. Even in chaos, Alexander endured. Chapter 2: The Hellenistic Era. Alexander's empire may have collapsed in politics, but it flourished in culture. After his death, something peculiar happened. The lands he had conquered, lands once deeply rooted in Persian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Indian traditions, began to speak, think, and even worship like Greeks. This was not a forced transformation. There were no laws demanding it. But the ripple of Alexander's conquests created a cultural undertow that would reshape half the known world. Historians call it the Hellenistic Age, from the Greek word Hellas, meaning Greece, a period that stretched for 3 centuries after Alexander's death. During this time, Greek ideas, language, art, science, and philosophy blended with the cultures of the East. And from that blend emerged something entirely new. In cities across Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and beyond, marketplaces rang with a strange mixture of languages, Greek spoken with Persian rhythms, or Egyptian gods described in the vocabulary of Homer. Greek became the lingua franca, the common tongue of administration, trade, and science, in places that had never before heard of Plato or Pythagoras. A merchant in Alexandria could do business with a banker in Babylon. A doctor in Pergamon could read a treatise written in Athens. This single shared language became the invisible thread that tied the region together. But it was not just words that traveled. So did ideas. Temples in Mesopotamia began to feature Greek columns. Eastern deities were reimagined through a Hellenic lens. Local rulers adopted Greek names, wore Greek clothing, even commissioned statues of themselves in the heroic, nude style of Greek sculpture. One of the most striking examples is found in Bactria, a rugged region in what is now Afghanistan and northern Pakistan. There, Greek settlers founded cities with theaters and gymnasiums. For a time, the region even had its own Greco-Bactrian kingdom, where kings minted coins bearing both Greek and local symbols. In some depictions, you can see Zeus sitting next to elephants, a marriage of mythologies that Alexander himself might have smiled upon. In Egypt, the city of Alexandria became the crown jewel of this cultural fusion. It housed the Library of Alexandria, a place where scholars from all over the Mediterranean and Near East came to study texts from multiple civilizations. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, history, all were copied, translated, and expanded upon in the great halls of this intellectual sanctuary. The Hellenistic Age was, in many ways, a golden age of exchange. Art became more expressive, showing emotion and movement rather than stiff, godlike stillness. Philosophy turned outward, blending Stoic and Eastern ideas about nature, fate, and the universe. Religion became more personal, as Eastern mystery cults gained popularity in Greek cities, and Greek gods found new homes in Eastern temples. And all of this was sparked by one man's military ambition. Of course, the spread of Greek culture was not without friction. In many places, it sat uneasily atop older traditions. Some resisted, some adapted, and others simply endured in parallel. But even so, the influence was lasting. Even when Rome rose to power and swept through the remains of Alexander's world, it inherited the Hellenistic framework. Roman education was Greek. Roman religion borrowed Greek gods. Roman architecture mimicked Greek forms. In this way, the Hellenistic Age never truly ended. It simply faded into the foundations of Western civilization. Alexander, for all his violence, left behind a world that was not only connected by trade routes and military roads, but by shared curiosity, a world that asked new questions, imagined new gods, and saw itself through new eyes. He died young. His empire died soon after. But the ideas he set loose, the cities, the art, the books, the dreams, lived far longer. And somewhere in the echo of that age, long after the spears fell silent, the voice of Greece continued to speak. The death of Alexander did not signal an end. In many ways, it marked a beginning, not of political stability, but of cultural transformation. The Hellenistic Age, set in motion by his conquests, was not just a period of transition. It was a long echo, a slow, sweeping expansion of Greek influence across foreign landscapes, languages, and belief systems. From the edges of the Mediterranean to the mountains of Persia, cities took on new forms. Temples rose with fluted columns and triangular pediments. Public squares opened in the shadow of colonnades. Theaters were carved into hillsides. Even cities that had never seen a Macedonian spear adopted the aesthetics of Greece. Geometry became sacred. Symmetry was celebrated. The built environment began to mirror the ideals of reason and harmony, ideals that had once lived only in the minds of Athenian philosophers. But this was no mere architectural export. Hellenistic architecture was not static. It evolved. Buildings became grander, more theatrical, more emotionally charged. The Stoic temples of classical Greece gave way to sprawling palace complexes and ornate sanctuaries. The influence of Eastern materials and traditions brought new textures and new scales. Beauty was no longer just mathematical. It was dramatic and sometimes overwhelming. The same shift occurred in art. In Athens, the perfect male form had once symbolized rationality and restraint. Now in Pergamon and Alexandria, sculptures wept, struggled, reached skyward in agony or ecstasy. Artists began to show not just bodies, but souls, twisted in battle, gripped by fear, or lost in divine ecstasy. Even myth changed shape. The gods of old were made more human, more flawed, more reachable. Heroes bled, lovers mourned. In this new world, art told stories of suffering, longing, and inner conflict. The grandeur of empire was matched by the intimacy of emotion. And while temples and statues reflected this shift, philosophy began to turn inward as well. In the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, philosophy had focused on politics, virtue, and the ideal form of the city. But in the Hellenistic world, people faced new uncertainties. The old polis had been replaced by sprawling kingdoms. The citizen had become a subject. The world felt wider and colder. Out of this anxiety came new schools of thought: Stoicism, Epicureanism, and skepticism. Each offered a response to uncertainty. The Stoics taught discipline, that one should accept fate, control desire, and live according to nature's laws. The Epicureans sought peace in modest pleasure and the absence of pain. The skeptics doubted everything, finding comfort in withholding judgment. These were not abstract ideas for scholars in cloaks. They were lifelines, tools for ordinary people trying to survive in a chaotic world. Alongside philosophy, religion transformed. In Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, local gods were renamed, merged, and reimagined through Greek lenses. Zeus became fused with Ammonius. Artemis resembled Eastern fertility deities. Mystery cults flourished, secretive, emotionally charged rites promising personal salvation or rebirth. The Greek world had once worshipped publicly, collectively. But now, religion became more private, more mystical, more about the individual soul. Even Rome, when it came later, would inherit these spiritual patterns. The Hellenistic model of divine kingship, sacred rituals, and apocalyptic prophecy would find echoes in Roman emperors, in early Christianity, and in the mystery cults that flourished across the empire. And then there was science. It is easy to forget that many of the world's first great scientists lived not in classical Athens, but in Hellenistic Alexandria. There, inside the museum and the library, minds like Euclid, Eratosthenes, Archimedes, and Herophilus mapped geometry, measured the earth, invented machines, and dissected the human body. Their discoveries were not isolated. They were part of a culture that valued knowledge across boundaries: astronomy and medicine, philosophy and engineering, all under one roof. Greek curiosity, fused with Egyptian records, Babylonian observations, and Persian methods, created a new standard of intellectual rigor. What had once been the dream of a few philosophers became the ambition of a civilization. And through all of this, Alexander's name remained, not as a scientist, or a builder, or a thinker, but as the man who lit the fuse, who opened the door. who connected worlds that had never met. The Hellenistic legacy was not Greek in the pure sense. It was Greek and Persian and Egyptian and Babylonian. It was born from conquest, but grew through exchange. And for centuries, long after his empire crumbled, the world continued to speak in the grammar of Alexander's dreams. Chapter 3: Myth and Memory. Not all legacies are written in stone. Some are whispered, some are imagined, some are retold, reshaped, and embellished until they cease being history altogether and become something much harder to erase. Myth. That is what happened to Alexander the Great. After his death in Babylon, Alexander's physical empire collapsed. His generals divided it. His bloodline vanished. His cities were renamed or forgotten. But his image, the heroic, ever-young, impossibly brilliant conqueror, refused to die. From the moment the torch dimmed in his hand, the storytelling began. In one version, he was the son of Zeus, not Philip, a thunderbolt disguised as a Macedonian king. Olympias, his mother, supposedly saw lightning strike her womb in a dream. A snake curled on her bed. Clearly, destiny was involved. In another, he didn't die at all, merely ascended like a god or vanished into the east to rule a secret kingdom. His death, inconvenient and unceremonious, simply didn't satisfy the demands of his legend. So storytellers rewrote it. The Romans, of course, adored him. Julius Caesar wept at his statue in Spain, lamenting that he had conquered nothing by the age at which Alexander had ruled half the world. Augustus studied his campaigns. Pompey and Trajan traced his footsteps in Asia. To be a Roman general was, in part, to chase the ghost of Alexander. But the myth didn't stop in the classical world. In medieval Europe, Alexander's name resurfaced in the Alexander Romance, a wildly popular collection of semi-fictional tales that placed him in lands of talking trees, griffins, and sea monsters. He met the queen of the Amazons. He built a wall to keep out the monstrous tribes of Gog and Magog. He flew through the sky in a chariot pulled by winged beasts and explored the ocean in a glass submarine. None of it was true, of course, but that didn't seem to matter, because truth had already given way to legend. In Persia, he was remembered with more ambivalence. As Iskander, the two-horned conqueror, sometimes admired, sometimes resented. In Islamic traditions, he was often identified with Tul-Karnain, a mysterious figure mentioned in the Quran, who traveled to the ends of the earth and built a mighty wall to contain chaos. And so, across cultures and religions, Alexander became a blank canvas. A conqueror, a prophet, a king, a sinner, a philosopher, a god. He could be wise or cruel, inspired or cursed. The facts of his life mattered less than the shape of the story. And that shape was always the same. The brilliant young man who reached too far, flew too high, and fell too soon. It is a story humanity cannot resist. And in Alexander, it found one of its most irresistible vessels. Even in modern times, Alexander remains one of the most written about, filmed, and analyzed figures in ancient history. Movies from the 1950s to the early 2000s have portrayed him as a tortured genius, a warrior king, or a boy overwhelmed by fate. Historians argue about every detail, from his sexuality to his death. But the public? The public still sees the blazing figure in shining armor, cutting through Asia like a sword through silk. Alexander sells. Because ambition sells, so does tragedy. He was the first man to conquer the world, and the first to be destroyed by it. And perhaps that's why he continues to haunt our stories. Not because of what he built, but because of what it cost him. Because for all his glory, Alexander never made it home. He died in a foreign palace, among foreign generals, whispering of new campaigns that would never happen. And in that ending, abrupt and unfinished, there's a kind of poetry. The kind of poetry that myths are made of. So when you hear his name, remember, you are not remembering a man. You are remembering a story, a legend, a silhouette against the sunset of empires. In the grand theater of history, there are figures who live long enough to be forgotten, and then there are those who die young and become immortal. Alexander, it seems, chose the latter. At just 32, the man who had swept through the known world like wildfire was gone. No dramatic final battle, no enemy at the gates, no last charge in a legend. He simply fell ill in Babylon, a fever, perhaps, or poison, or something entirely mundane like typhoid. And then, he was still. It was not the ending anyone expected, least of all Alexander himself. At the time of his death, he was planning his next conquest, Arabia. His armies were being refitted. His mind was still churning with ideas of exploration and domination. His dream, to connect East and West in one vast network of cities, trade, and glory, remained incomplete. But history has a strange sense of timing. His early death froze that dream in place. And it was that incompleteness that helped make him eternal. Alexander became a symbol not just of what is possible, but of what is almost possible. A figure who nearly did it all, but was stopped just short. He is ambition unfulfilled, genius interrupted, a flame snuffed out mid-blaze. And people remember that, because deep down we understand it. We see it in the myth of Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun. We see it in the romantic allure of youth lost at its peak. We see in artists who die young, in poets who leave behind a single perfect book, in musicians who vanish before their second album. Completion is neat, but unfinished greatness that lingers. Alexander's legacy is built on that edge. Had he lived, would he have faded into mediocrity? Would he have become a tyrant? Would the cracks in his empire, already showing, have widened under his rule? These are questions we never have to answer, because death cut the story short. And history loves a story that ends too soon. This is why Alexander continues to appear, not just in dusty textbooks, but in movies, novels, TV shows, and comic books. His life has all the ingredients of modern myth: a child prodigy, a domineering parent, a mysterious mentor, an unstoppable rise, and a sudden fall. He is, quite literally, the blueprint for the great man narrative. His charisma, his military brilliance, his almost reckless daring, they're irresistible. Even those who know little about ancient history tend to know of Alexander. He exists in cultural memory alongside names like Napoleon, Julius Caesar, and Genghis Khan. But unlike them, his story doesn't end in exile, betrayal, or disillusionment. It ends in promise. That's the trick. By dying at the peak of his power, Alexander became pure potential. Every generation projects something different onto him. For some, he's the enlightened ruler who wanted to unite East and West. For others, he's a megalomaniac who burned cities and worshipped his own legend. He could be the warrior king, the philosopher conqueror, the cursed hero. He is flexible. He adapts. And still, beneath all the interpretations, one thing remains: the tragic edge. For all his victories, Alexander died alone. His closest companion, Hephaestion, had died months earlier, and Alexander never recovered. His empire unraveled within days. His generals fought over his corpse. His mother, wife, and son were all murdered in the chaos that followed. There was no dynasty, no monument that survived, just stories. And perhaps that is the point. In the end, Alexander's real power wasn't his empire. It was his image, an image of brilliance, of youth, of vision, of reaching farther than anyone had dared. And while kingdoms fall, while cities crumble and maps are redrawn, symbols endure. They survive not in stone, but in memory. They linger in bedtime stories, in marble statues, in whispered admiration. Alexander the Great, the man who tried to touch the ends of the earth, never made it home. But in not returning, he went somewhere stranger, into legend. And that, in its quiet, impossible way, may have been the greatest conquest of all. Conclusion. He was crowned young, conquered fast, and died before his shadow could catch up. Alexander the Great carved his name into history, not just with swords, but with stories. He built an empire, yes, but he also built a myth, and that proved far harder to destroy. His cities may lie in ruins, his bones long lost to time, but the idea of Alexander marches on, a symbol of ambition without limit, genius without rest, A man who conquered the world and couldn't quite conquer himself. Whether seen as a hero, a tyrant, or a tragic dreamer in bronze armor, one thing remains. Alexander never truly disappeared. He simply stopped being a man and became a memory, polished, exaggerated, endlessly reinterpreted. And perhaps that is the fate of all great figures, to be remembered not for what they were, but for what we needed them to be. Sleep well, dear Conqueror. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to create more quality products. Now go to sleep in sweet dreams.